The Spanish Empire, from unity to global dominion. Before we begin this journey through the history of the Spanish Empire, don't forget to support our work. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future documentaries. Introduction: The dawn of the first global empire. In the annals of human history, few stories capture the imagination quite like the rise of the Spanish Empire. Picture, if you will, the late 15th century, a world where oceans were barriers, not highways, where continents existed in isolation from one another, and where the very concept of a global empire was unimaginable. Yet from the Iberian Peninsula, a land that had known 8 centuries of conflict and fragmentation, would emerge the first truly global empire in human history. An empire where, as the saying went, the sun never set, not merely because of its vast extent, but because it literally spanned every inhabited continent, connecting civilizations that had never before been in contact. This is not a tale of inevitable conquest or predetermined destiny. Rather, it is the story of how a collection of medieval kingdoms, through a series of remarkable unions, discoveries, and alliances, would create a network of territories that stretched from the silver mines of Potosi in South America to the spice markets of Manila in the Philippines, from the universities of Salamanca to the missions of California. The Spanish Empire was born not from the ambitions of a single ruler, but from the convergence of multiple historical currents, the completion of the Reconquista, the marriage of 2 powerful monarchs, the genius of explorers and navigators, and perhaps most crucially, the ability to forge alliances with indigenous peoples across vast distances and cultural divides. As we embark on this journey through 3 centuries of Spanish expansion, we must ask ourselves, how did Spain rise from unifying small kingdoms to ruling over vast territories across the globe? What made this empire different from those that came before? And how did it manage to maintain cohesion across such unprecedented distances in an age before modern communication? The answers lie not in simple narratives of conquest, but in understanding the complex web of politics, religion, economics, and human relationships that bound this empire together. Tonight, as you rest, let us travel back to that pivotal year of 1492, when the world changed forever. Chapter 1. The Birth of Unity, the Catholic Monarchs. To understand the Spanish Empire, we must first understand that Spain itself was not always Spain. In the year 1469, the Iberian Peninsula was a mosaic of competing kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, and the last Muslim kingdom of Granada. Each had its own traditions, languages, laws, and ambitions. It was in this fragmented world that 2 young people would meet and change the course of history. Isabella of Castile was 18 years old, intelligent, devoutly religious, and heir to the throne of Castile, the largest and most populous kingdom in Iberia. Ferdinand of Aragon was 17, astute in politics and warfare, and heir to the crown of Aragon, which included not only Aragon itself, but also Catalonia, Valencia, and significant territories in the Mediterranean, including Sicily and Sardinia. Their marriage in 1469 was initially a political alliance, designed to strengthen both kingdoms against their enemies. Yet it would prove to be something far more significant, the foundation of modern Spain and, ultimately, the world's first global empire. Isabella became Queen of Castile in 1474, and Ferdinand became King of Aragon in 1479. Together, they would be known to history as the Catholic monarchs, Los Reyes Católicos, a title granted by Pope Alexander VI in recognition of their devotion to the faith and their role in expanding Christendom. But their union was more than ceremonial. These 2 remarkable individuals complemented each other perfectly. Isabella brought to the partnership the vast resources of Castile, its growing population, and its tradition of reconquest against Muslim territories. Ferdinand contributed Aragon's sophisticated administrative systems, its commercial networks in the Mediterranean, and his own considerable skills as a diplomat and military strategist. Together, they embarked on a program of centralization and expansion that would transform their kingdoms. They established a professional army, created a unified legal system, and most importantly, they set their sights on the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, the Kingdom of Granada. The conquest of Granada was not merely a military campaign. It was the culmination of nearly 8 centuries of Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. Since 711, when Muslim armies from North Africa had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered most of Iberia, Christian kingdoms had slowly pushed southward, reclaiming territory generation by generation. By the time of Ferdinand and Isabella, Granada remained as the last jewel of Al-Andalus, the sophisticated Muslim civilization that had flourished in southern Spain. The kingdom was centered around the magnificent city of Granada, with its stunning Alhambra palace complex, a testament to centuries of Islamic architectural achievement. The war for Granada began in 1482 and would last 10 years. It was not a simple conquest, but a complex campaign involving sieges, diplomacy, and careful maneuvering. The Catholic monarchs demonstrated remarkable patience and strategic thinking. Rather than attempting a single decisive battle, they systematically captured Granada's outlying territories, gradually isolating the capital city itself. The final siege of Granada began in the spring of 1491. Ferdinand and Isabella established a permanent camp outside the city walls, a camp so elaborate and well-built that they named it Santa Fe, Holy Faith. From this base, they maintained a complete blockade of the city, cutting off all supplies and reinforcements. The end came not through storm and fury, but through negotiation. On January 2nd, 1492, Boabdil, the last Muslim ruler of Granada, surrendered the keys of the city to Ferdinand and Isabella. The moment was both triumphant and poignant. Legend tells us that, as Boabdil looked back at his lost kingdom from a mountain pass, he wept, prompting his mother to reportedly say, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." With the fall of Granada, the Reconquista was complete. For the first time in nearly 8 centuries, the entire Iberian Peninsula was under Christian rule. But more than that, Spain was now unified under a single crown, with vast resources, a battle-tested army, and monarchs with global ambitions. The terms of Granada's surrender were remarkably generous for the time. Muslims were allowed to keep their property, practice their religion, and maintain their customs. This policy of relative tolerance would become a characteristic of early Spanish rule, a pragmatic approach that recognized the value of existing populations and their knowledge. Yet even as they celebrated this triumph, Ferdinand and Isabella were already looking beyond the borders of Spain. The same year that Granada fell, 1492, would witness an even more momentous event, the voyage of a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus, who believed he could reach the Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. Chapter 2. The Year That Changed Everything. 1492. If there is a single year that changed the course of human history, it might well be 1492. In this extraordinary 12-month period, the world witnessed events that would reshape civilization. The completion of the Reconquista, the expulsion of Jews from Spain, and most momentously, Columbus's first voyage to what Europeans would come to call the New World. Christopher Columbus was not Spanish by birth. Born in the Republic of Genoa around 1451, he was a seasoned mariner who had sailed throughout the Mediterranean and along the Atlantic coasts of Europe and Africa. But Columbus possessed something that set him apart from other navigators of his time, an unshakable belief that the Earth was smaller than most scholars believed, and that the Indies could be reached by sailing westward across the Atlantic. Columbus had spent years seeking support for his ambitious plan. He had approached the courts of Portugal, England, and France, only to be turned away. The learned men of these courts, consulting the works of ancient geographers, believed that the Western Ocean was far too vast to cross safely. They were, as it turned out, absolutely correct, but they had no knowledge of the American continents that lay between Europe and Asia. It was in Spain, in the court of the Catholic monarchs, that Columbus finally found the support he needed. But even here, success was not immediate. Columbus first presented his plan to Isabella and Ferdinand in 1486, and it took 6 long years of negotiation and persuasion before they finally agreed to sponsor his expedition. What convinced them was not just Columbus's passion, but the strategic advantages such a voyage might bring. If successful, it would give Spain access to the lucrative spice trade of the Indies, breaking the monopoly held by Italian merchants and their Ottoman suppliers. Moreover, with the Reconquista now complete, Spain had the resources and the confidence to attempt such an ambitious undertaking. On April 17, 1492, the Catholic monarchs signed the capitulations of Santa Fe, granting Columbus the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of any lands he might discover, and Governor of any islands he might find. They also promised him a tenth of all profits from any trade routes he established. Columbus assembled a small fleet of 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. These were not the grand galleons that would later become synonymous with Spanish exploration, but relatively modest vessels, typical of the coastal trading ships of their time. The Santa Maria, the largest, was perhaps only 85 feet long, smaller than many modern yachts. On August 3, 1492, as the last Muslim refugees were still leaving Granada, Columbus's little fleet sailed from the Spanish port of Palos de la Frontera. The timing was not coincidental. The same ships that had carried Columbus's supplies had previously been used to transport Jewish exiles from Spain. For 1492 was also the year of the Alhambra Decree, which ordered all Jews to convert to Christianity or leave the country. The voyage across the Atlantic was a journey into the unknown. Columbus and his crew were sailing into waters that no European had ever crossed, guided only by Columbus's calculations and his faith in divine providence. The crews grew increasingly nervous as days turned into weeks with no sign of land. There were threats of mutiny, stories of sea monsters, and constant anxiety about running out of supplies. But Columbus pressed on, driven by his absolute conviction that land lay ahead. On October 12, 1492, after 36 days at sea, a lookout aboard the Pinta spotted what appeared to be a beach by moonlight. As dawn broke, they saw an island with trees and freshwater, what Columbus would name San Salvador, though its indigenous inhabitants called it Guanahani. Columbus believed he had reached the Indies, and so he called the people he encountered Indians. These were the Taino people, who inhabited many of the Caribbean islands. They were skilled farmers, fishermen, and navigators, with a complex society organized into chiefdoms spread across the Caribbean archipelago. The encounter between Columbus and the Taino was perhaps history's most significant first contact between civilizations. Columbus wrote in his journal of the indigenous people, "They are very well-made people, with handsome bodies and very fine faces. They ought to be good servants and of good intelligence, since I see that they very quickly repeat whatever is said to them." This observation, seemingly innocent, would have profound implications. Columbus's perception of the indigenous people as potential servants and their apparent intelligence and willingness to learn would shape Spanish colonial policy for centuries to come. Unlike later colonial powers who would often view indigenous peoples as obstacles to be removed, the Spanish would develop a complex system that, while certainly exploitative, was based on the assumption that indigenous peoples could be converted, educated, and integrated into Spanish society. During his first voyage, Columbus explored several Caribbean islands, establishing relationships with various indigenous groups, and taking careful note of the gold ornaments worn by some of the people he met. When he returned to Spain in March 1493, he brought with him samples of gold, exotic plants and animals, and several indigenous people who had agreed to accompany him. The news of Columbus's success spread rapidly throughout Europe. Here was proof that the ocean sea could be crossed, that new lands existed beyond the European imagination, and that these lands contained gold and other valuable resources. More importantly for the Spanish crown, Columbus had claimed all these territories for Castile, dramatically expanding Spanish dominion overnight. But the true significance of 1492 would only become apparent over the following decades. Columbus's voyage had initiated what historians now call the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, cultures, human populations, technology, and ideas between the Americas and the Old World. This exchange would transform both hemispheres in ways that Columbus could never have imagined. For indigenous Americans, the consequences would be profound and often tragic. Diseases brought by European smallpox, measles, typhus would devastate populations that had no immunity to these ailments. Estimates suggest that the indigenous population of the Americas declined by as much as 90% in the century following Columbus's voyage, making it one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. Yet the exchange was not entirely one-sided. American crops maize, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, tobacco would transform European agriculture and cuisine. American silver would fuel the global economy for centuries. And American civilizations would contribute significantly to the development of Spanish colonial society, creating new forms of art, architecture, and culture that blended European, indigenous, and later African elements. As 1492 drew to a close, few could have predicted the magnitude of change that Columbus's voyage had set in motion. The Spanish Empire was still just a dream in the minds of ambitious monarchs and adventurous navigators. But the foundation had been laid for what would become the most extensive empire in human history up to that time. Chapter 3. First Steps in Paradise. Early Caribbean Settlements. The Caribbean islands that Columbus had discovered were, to European eyes, a tropical paradise. Crystal clear waters, pristine beaches, abundant fruit trees, and a seemingly endless growing season promised riches and comfort beyond European imagination. Yet transforming these discoveries into a functioning colonial empire would prove far more complex than anyone initially realized. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Caribbean between 1492 and 1504, each revealing more of this new world's complexity. During his second voyage in 1493, he arrived with a fleet of 17 ships carrying over 1,200 men, soldiers, sailors, craftsmen, farmers, and priests. This was no longer a voyage of exploration, but the beginning of settlement and colonization. The Spanish established their first permanent settlement at La Isabela, on the northern coast of present-day Dominican Republic, in 1494. Named after Queen Isabella, it was intended to be the capital of Spain's new American territories. But La Isabela faced immediate challenges that would foreshadow many of the difficulties of colonial administration. The Spanish colonists had come expecting to find a land flowing with gold, where wealth could be easily extracted and shipped back to Europe. Instead, they found that gold was relatively scarce and difficult to obtain. The indigenous Taino people did possess some gold ornaments, but they had acquired these through trade networks that stretched across the Caribbean, and were not particularly interested in mining large quantities of the metal. Moreover, the Spanish colonists were largely unprepared for the realities of tropical life. Many were minor nobles hidalgos who considered manual labor beneath their station. Others were soldiers and sailors with no experience in farming or crafts. Disease struck the settlement repeatedly, and conflicts arose both between Spanish colonists and indigenous peoples, and among the Spanish themselves. Columbus, despite his genius as a navigator, proved to be a poor colonial administrator. He was authoritarian in his approach, yet unable to maintain order or productivity. Complaints about his governance reached the Spanish court, and in 1500, he was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains, though he was quickly released and pardoned by the Catholic monarchs. The failure of La Isabela led to a more pragmatic approach to colonization. In 1496, Columbus's brother Bartholomew established a new settlement on the southern coast of Hispaniola, which they called Santo Domingo. This city, founded in a more suitable location with better harbor facilities and access to the interior, would become the first permanent European city in the Americas, and the launching point for all subsequent Spanish exploration and conquest. Santo Domingo represented a new phase in Spanish colonization. Rather than expecting immediate wealth from gold mining, the colonists began to develop more sustainable economic activities. They imported European livestock cattle, pigs, and horses which thrived in the Caribbean environment. They established sugar plantations using techniques learned from Spanish experience in the Canary Islands. And most importantly, they began to develop the administrative and legal frameworks that would govern Spanish America for the next 3 centuries. The encomienda system, which would become central to Spanish colonial administration, was first implemented in the Caribbean. Under this system, Spanish colonists were granted the right to demand tribute and labor from specific indigenous communities in exchange for providing protection and Christian instruction. The encomienda was not technically slavery. The indigenous people remained free and retained their land, but in practice, it often involved severe exploitation. The encomienda system reflected the Spanish crown's attempt to balance several competing objectives, rewarding Spanish colonists for their investments and risks, generating revenue for the royal treasury, protecting indigenous peoples from complete exploitation, and promoting the conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity. It was a compromise solution that satisfied no one completely, but allowed the colonial system to function. The Catholic Church played a crucial role in these early Caribbean settlements. Spanish law required that indigenous peoples be converted to Christianity, and missionaries accompanied every expedition and settlement. The first diocese in the Americas was established in Santo Domingo in 1511, with ecclesiastical authority over all Spanish territories in the New World. Some churchmen became fierce advocates for indigenous rights. The Dominican friar Antonio de Montesinos delivered a sermon in Santo Domingo in 1511 that challenged the entire basis of Spanish colonization. "Tell me," he asked his congregation of Spanish colonists, "by what right or justice do you keep these Indians in such a cruel and horrible servitude? Are these not men? Have they not rational souls?" This sermon inspired another Dominican, Bartolomé de las Casas, who would become the most famous defender of indigenous rights in the Spanish Empire. Las Casas spent his life documenting and protesting Spanish mistreatment of indigenous peoples, and his writings would later be used by Spain's enemies to create the Black Legend, the propaganda campaign that portrayed Spanish colonialism as uniquely cruel and exploitative. Yet Las Casas's protests were heard at the highest levels of Spanish government. In 1512, the Spanish crown promulgated the Laws of Burgos, the first comprehensive code governing treatment of indigenous peoples in the Americas. These laws required that indigenous people be treated as free persons, that they be paid for their labor, that they receive religious instruction, and that their children be educated. While these laws were often ignored in practice, their very existence demonstrated that the Spanish Empire was grappling seriously with the moral implications of colonization. The Caribbean settlements also served as laboratories for developing new forms of society and culture. Spanish colonists intermarried with indigenous women, creating a mestizo population that would become central to Spanish-American society. African slaves were introduced to supplement indigenous labor, particularly as disease reduced native populations. By 1510, the Caribbean islands were home to a complex multiracial society that included Europeans, indigenous Americans, Africans, and various mixed populations. This racial mixing was not merely tolerated by Spanish authorities, it was often encouraged. Unlike later colonial systems that would emphasize racial separation and purity, the Spanish Empire developed elaborate classifications for different racial combinations and generally allowed for social mobility based on factors other than race alone. The early Caribbean settlements also developed the maritime networks that would become crucial to the Spanish Empire's expansion. Ships sailing between Spain and the Caribbean established regular routes that would later extend to Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines. The port of Santo Domingo became a hub for further exploration, serving as the departure point for expeditions to the mainland of North and South America. By 1515, the Spanish had established settlements throughout the Greater Antilles, Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola, and were beginning to explore the mainland coasts of Central and South America. The indigenous population of the Caribbean had been devastated by disease and exploitation, but a new colonial society was emerging that would serve as the template for Spanish expansion throughout the Americas. The lessons learned in the Caribbean about colonial administration, about relations with indigenous peoples, about economic development, and about the challenges of governing distant territories would prove invaluable as Spanish attention turned to the vast continental empires of the Aztecs and Incas. The small Caribbean islands had served as a proving ground for techniques of conquest, settlement, and governance that would soon be applied on a far grander scale. Chapter 4: Alliances and Conquest. The fall of the Aztec Empire. As Spanish settlements in the Caribbean became established, rumors began to reach the colonists of vast empires on the mainland, civilizations with great cities, sophisticated agriculture, and most tantalizingly, enormous quantities of gold and silver. These rumors would soon draw Spanish attention to the coast of Mexico and set in motion one of history's most remarkable encounters between civilizations. The Mexico Empire, which we now commonly call the Aztec Empire, was indeed a marvel of human achievement. Centered on the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, it was home to perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The empire extended from coast to coast across central Mexico, encompassing millions of people organized into hundreds of city-states and ethnic groups. But the Mexico Empire was not a unified nation in the modern sense. It was a confederation held together by tribute payments, military alliances, and the constant threat of force. The Mexico people, who called themselves Mexica, had risen to dominance only in the previous century through a combination of military prowess, political cunning, and strategic alliances. Many of the peoples they ruled remembered their independence and chafed under Mexican domination. This political fragmentation would prove crucial to understanding how a small band of Spanish adventurers could topple such a mighty empire. The Spanish conquest of Mexico was not simply a story of European technology overwhelming indigenous resistance. It was fundamentally a story of alliance, diplomacy, and civil war, in which Spanish forces served more as catalysts than as primary actors. Hernán Cortés was 34 years old when he landed on the Mexican coast in February 1519. Born into the minor nobility of Extremadura, the same harsh region that had produced many of Spain's most famous conquistadors, Cortés had spent 15 years in the Caribbean, first as a colonist in Hispaniola, and later as an official in the conquest of Cuba. Cortés was not originally chosen to lead the expedition to Mexico. That honor had gone to another conquistador, but political maneuvering and questions about loyalty to the Cuban governor led to Cortés being given command at the last moment. Sensing an opportunity that might never come again, Cortés quickly organized his expedition and departed Cuba before his orders could be changed. The Spanish force that landed at Veracruz was remarkably small, perhaps 600 men, 16 horses, and a few cannons. By any conventional military analysis, such a force should have had no chance against an empire of millions. Yet Cortés possessed several crucial advantages, beginning with an indigenous woman named Melancin, whom the Spanish called Doña Marina and historians often refer to as La Malinche. Melancin had been given to the Spanish as part of a group of tribute payments, but she quickly proved invaluable as an interpreter and cultural broker. She spoke both Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, and Mayan, and she rapidly learned Spanish. More than just a translator, she became Cortés's advisor on indigenous politics and customs, helping him navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized central Mexico. Through Melancin, Cortés learned of the deep resentment that many indigenous groups felt toward Mexican rule. The first major alliance came with the city-state of Tlaxcala, which had maintained its independence through constant warfare with the Mexico Empire. The Tlaxcalans initially fought against the Spanish, but after several battles, they recognized that these strangers might be the allies they needed to defeat their ancient enemies. The Tlaxcalan alliance was crucial to Spanish success. The Tlaxcalans provided not only thousands of warriors, but also crucial intelligence about Mexican military tactics, political divisions, and the layout of Tenochtitlan. They also supplied porters, food, and logistical support that allowed the small Spanish force to campaign far from their coastal base. As the Spanish Tlaxcalan army marched toward Tenochtitlan, they were joined by other indigenous groups eager to overthrow Mexican rule. The Totonacs of the coast, the Sempolans, and numerous smaller communities saw the Spanish as potential liberators rather than conquerors. This indigenous coalition eventually numbered in the tens of thousands, with Spanish forces forming only a tiny fraction of the total army. When Cortés and his allies first entered Tenochtitlan in November 1519, they were received peacefully by the Emperor Moctezuma Roman II. The Mexican ruler was uncertain how to respond to these strange visitors. Some of his advisors believed the Spanish might be gods or divine messengers, while others counseled immediate attack. Moctezuma chose a middle course, receiving the Spanish as honored guests while attempting to assess their true intentions. For several months, the Spanish remained in Tenochtitlan as Moctezuma's guests, all the while gathering intelligence about the city's defenses and the empire's political structure. But the situation was inherently unstable. The Spanish were few, far from support, and surrounded by a potentially hostile population. The Mexica were increasingly suspicious of their guests' motives and growing tired of their presence. The crisis came in May 1520 during a religious festival. Spanish forces, left in the city while Cortés was away dealing with a rival Spanish expedition, attacked a gathering of Mexican nobles, killing dozens. This massacre shattered any possibility of peaceful coexistence and triggered a general uprising against the Spanish and their indigenous allies. The Spanish were forced to flee Tenochtitlan on the night of June 30, 1520, in what they called the Noche Triste, the Sad Night. Many Spanish soldiers died in the fighting, and those who survived owed their lives largely to their Tlaxcalan allies, who fought a desperate rearguard action to protect the retreat. But rather than ending the Spanish threat, the expulsion from Tenochtitlan marked the beginning of a new phase of the conflict. Over the following months, Cortés regrouped his forces and forged new alliances with indigenous groups throughout central Mexico. The political situation had changed dramatically. Moctezuma had died during the fighting, and his successor, Cuauhtémoc, was determined to drive the foreigners from Mexico permanently. What followed was not so much a Spanish conquest as a Mexican civil war, with the Spanish serving as the focal point for a coalition of indigenous groups opposed to Mexican rule. The siege of Tenochtitlan, which began in May 1521, involved perhaps 200,000 indigenous warriors fighting alongside fewer than 1,000 Spanish soldiers. The siege was a grinding campaign of attrition that lasted nearly 3 months. The Spanish and their allies systematically captured the causeways that connected the island city to the mainland, cutting off food supplies and reinforcements. They also launched a naval campaign on Lake Texcoco, using small ships they had built using techniques learned from Tlaxcalan shipwrights. But perhaps the most devastating weapon in the Spanish arsenal was one they did not control: disease. Smallpox, typhus, and other European diseases ravaged the population of Tenochtitlan during the siege. These diseases, to which indigenous Americans had no immunity, killed thousands and left many more too weak to fight effectively. Cuauhtémoc and his warriors fought with desperate courage, defending their city building by building, canal by canal. But they were fighting not just against Spanish weapons, but against disease, starvation, and the accumulated grievances of peoples who had been subject to Mexican rule for generations. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to flee the fallen city. Tenochtitlan was in ruins, its population devastated, its great temples and palaces destroyed. But the Mexico Empire had not simply been conquered by Spain. It had been destroyed by an indigenous coalition that saw alliance with the Spanish as their path to freedom from Mexican domination. The Spanish victory in Mexico was thus not a simple triumph of European technology over indigenous backwardness. It was the result of careful diplomacy, strategic alliance building, and the exploitation of existing political divisions. The Spanish succeeded because they were able to position themselves as leaders of an indigenous liberation movement, not as foreign conquerors. This pattern, using alliances with indigenous groups to defeat dominant empires, would be repeated throughout Spanish expansion in the Americas. It reflected both the fragmented nature of pre-Columbian political systems and the Spanish genius for adaptation and alliance building that would characterize their empire for the next 3 centuries. Chapter 5. The Inca Alliance Conquest in the Andes. High in the Andes Mountains of South America, an empire even more extensive than that of the Mexica stretched along the western spine of the continent. The Tawantinsuyu, which we know as the Inca Empire, was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, extending over 2,500 miles from present-day Colombia to Chile, and encompassing perhaps 12 million people speaking dozens of different languages. Like the Mexico Empire, the Inca state was a relatively recent creation, having expanded rapidly over the previous century through conquest, alliance, and sophisticated administrative techniques. The Incas had developed remarkable systems of communication, using relay runners along their extensive road networks, and had created agricultural terraces that allowed them to feed their large population in the challenging Andean environment. But also, like Mexico, the Inca Empire was held together by force and maintained through tribute payments from subject peoples. Many of the ethnic groups within the empire, the Cañaris, the Huancas, the Chachapoyas, and others had been conquered relatively recently and retained distinct identities and grievances against Inca rule. When Francisco Pizarro landed on the coast of Peru in 1532, he found an empire in crisis. The Inca emperor Huayna Capac had died of smallpox around 1527, and his death had triggered a succession war between his sons Huascar and Atahualpa. This civil war had raged for 5 years, devastating the empire and creating exactly the kind of political divisions that the Spanish had learned to exploit in Mexico. Pizarro was a veteran of the Caribbean and had served under Cortés during the conquest of Mexico. He understood the importance of indigenous alliances and came prepared to exploit the political fragmentation he expected to find. His force was even smaller than Cortés's had been, perhaps 180 men and 37 horses, but he had the advantage of experience and a clear understanding of Spanish strategic methods. The Spanish learned quickly that Atahualpa had recently defeated his brother Huascar and was consolidating his control over the empire. But they also discovered that many ethnic groups within the empire were eager for revenge against the Incas, or simply hoped to improve their position through alliance with these powerful newcomers. The Cañaris of southern Ecuador had been among the fiercest opponents of Inca expansion, and had suffered terribly during the recent civil war. They quickly allied with the Spanish, providing crucial intelligence about Inca military capabilities and political divisions. The Huancas of central Peru had also been devastated by the Civil War and saw the Spanish as potential liberators. Perhaps most importantly, the Chachapoyas people of northern Peru, who had been conquered by the Incas only a few decades earlier, became enthusiastic Spanish allies. The Chachapoyas were skilled warriors who knew the mountain terrain intimately, and their support would prove invaluable in the campaigns that followed. Pizarro's strategy was remarkably similar to that employed by Cortés in Mexico. Rather than attempting immediate conquest, he sought a meeting with the Inca emperor, hoping to capture or neutralize the head of the empire, and then work through existing political structures to establish Spanish control. The meeting took place at Cajamarca, a highland city, where Atahualpa was resting with his army after his victory in the Civil War. On November 16, 1532, Atahualpa agreed to meet the Spanish in Cajamarca's central plaza, apparently confident that his overwhelming numerical superiority, he had perhaps 80,000 warriors in the vicinity, would protect him from any treachery. But Pizarro had carefully planned an ambush. Spanish soldiers hidden in buildings around the plaza attacked Atahualpa's retinue, while Spanish cavalry charged into the crowded square. In the confusion and panic that followed, thousands of indigenous people were killed or wounded, and Atahualpa himself was captured. The capture of Atahualpa paralyzed the Inca Empire. The Inca political system was highly centralized, with all authority flowing from the emperor. Without clear leadership, the vast Inca bureaucracy was unable to mount effective resistance to Spanish expansion. Atahualpa attempted to purchase his freedom, by offering to fill a room with gold and 2 rooms with silver. This ransom payment, which took months to collect, provided the Spanish with enormous wealth, perhaps 20 tons of gold and silver, but did not secure Atahualpa's release. Instead, fearing that the emperor might organize resistance if released, Pizarro had him executed in July 1533. With Atahualpa dead and the imperial capital of Cusco in chaos, the Spanish were able to advance rapidly through the Andes, supported by their indigenous allies and meeting only scattered resistance. Many ethnic groups welcomed the Spanish as liberators, seeing them as the instrument of their freedom from Inca oppression. But the Spanish conquest of Peru was not simply a matter of political manipulation and indigenous alliance. The geographic and environmental challenges were immense. The Andes Mountains presented obstacles that no European army had previously faced: altitudes that left men gasping for breath, narrow mountain passes that could easily be defended, and weather conditions that could change from tropical heat to bitter cold within a single day's march. The Spanish succeeded in part because of their indigenous allies, who knew the terrain and the techniques needed to survive in the harsh Andean environment. The Chachapoyas, in particular, served not only as warriors but as guides, porters, and advisors on everything from mountain warfare to high-altitude agriculture. The Spanish also benefited from the sophisticated infrastructure that the Incas had created. The extensive road system that had allowed the Incas to control their vast empire now served to facilitate Spanish movement and communication. The agricultural terraces that had fed the Inca population continued to produce food for Spanish colonists and their indigenous allies. Perhaps most importantly, the Spanish were able to work through existing administrative structures rather than attempting to create entirely new systems of government. Many of the local officials who had administered the empire for the Incas were retained and simply required to serve new masters. This approach allowed for relatively smooth transitions in most areas and helped maintain the economic productivity that would become essential to Spanish colonial success. The Spanish also demonstrated remarkable adaptability in their approach to Andean society. Unlike in Mexico, where they had completely destroyed Tenochtitlan and built a new Spanish city on its ruins, in Peru, they chose to maintain Cusco as a functioning indigenous city while establishing their own capital at Lima on the coast. This decision reflected both practical considerations. Lima provided better access to maritime communications with Spain and a growing understanding of how to govern diverse populations across vast distances. The role of indigenous women in facilitating Spanish conquest and colonization was particularly important in Peru. Just as Melanson had been crucial to Cortés's success in Mexico, Pizarro relied heavily on indigenous women who served as interpreters, cultural mediators, and political advisors. These women, many of whom were from noble families, provided the Spanish with crucial insights into Andean politics and society. The conquest of the Inca Empire was completed remarkably quickly. By 1535, just 3 years after Pizarro's landing, Spanish control extended throughout most of the former Inca territories. But this rapid conquest was possible only because the Spanish were able to present themselves as the leaders of a coalition of indigenous peoples seeking freedom from Inca domination. The pattern established in Mexico and Peru, conquest through indigenous alliance, rather than simple military superiority, would characterize Spanish expansion throughout the Americas. It reflected both the political fragmentation of pre-Columbian societies and the Spanish genius for adaptation, negotiation, and alliance building that would become hallmarks of their imperial system. Chapter 6: The Spiritual Conquest, Missionaries, and Cultural Transformation. Alongside the soldiers and administrators who built the Spanish Empire, traveled another group of men whose mission was arguably even more ambitious than political conquest. The Catholic missionaries, who sought to convert the indigenous peoples of the Americas to Christianity. This spiritual conquest, as historians have termed it, would prove to be one of the most complex and controversial aspects of Spanish colonization. The Catholic Church had been intimately involved in Spanish expansion from the very beginning. Columbus's voyages were undertaken partly as a crusade to spread Christianity to new lands, and the papal bulls that granted Spain dominion over its American territories did so explicitly on the condition that the Spanish crown work to convert indigenous peoples to the Catholic faith. This religious mission was not merely an afterthought or a convenient justification for conquest. It was a fundamental driving force that shaped Spanish colonial policy in profound ways. Spanish law required that all indigenous peoples be offered the opportunity to convert to Christianity before any military action could be taken against them. The famous requirement that was read to indigenous peoples before battle was a legal document that offered them the choice between peaceful conversion and conquest. The first missionaries to arrive in the Americas were members of the regular orders Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and dedicated their lives to evangelical work. These men often came from privileged backgrounds in Spain, but chose to abandon comfort and security to work among indigenous peoples in remote and often dangerous locations. The Franciscans were particularly influential in the early phases of Spanish expansion. 12 Franciscan friars, known as the 12 Apostles of Mexico, arrived in New Spain in 1524 and established the foundation for what would become an extensive network of missions throughout the Americas. These men, led by Martin de Valencia, came with the explicit goal of creating a new kind of Christian society in the Americas, one that would avoid the corruption and materialism they saw in European Catholicism. The Dominican order, founded by Saint Dominic in the 13th century to combat heresy through preaching and education, also played a crucial role in the American missions. Dominican friars established some of the first universities in the Americas and became leading advocates for indigenous rights. The University of Santo Domingo, founded in 1538, was the first university in the Americas and served as a model for similar institutions throughout Spanish territories. The Augustinians, following the rule of St. Augustine, were particularly active in Peru and the Philippines. They developed sophisticated methods for learning indigenous languages and created some of the most important early dictionaries and grammars of American languages. Their linguistic work was crucial to the success of the evangelization effort and helped preserve indigenous languages that might otherwise have been lost. The missionaries faced enormous challenges in their work. They had to learn completely unfamiliar languages, understand complex religious and cultural systems that were entirely different from European traditions, and find ways to communicate Christian concepts that often had no direct equivalents in indigenous thought. The Nahuatl language of central Mexico, for example, had no word for God in the Christian sense. The closest equivalent referred to a collection of divine forces rather than a single supreme being. The missionaries had to either coin new terms or find creative ways to explain Christian concepts using existing vocabulary. This process of translation inevitably led to changes in both Christian doctrine and indigenous religious understanding. Perhaps more challenging than linguistic differences were the profound cultural and philosophical differences between Christian and indigenous worldviews. Many indigenous societies had cyclical rather than linear concepts of time, polytheistic rather than monotheistic religious systems, and very different ideas about the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds. The friars developed various strategies for addressing these challenges. Some, like the Franciscan Bernardino de Sahagun, made exhaustive studies of indigenous cultures, learning their languages, recording their histories, and documenting their religious practices. Sahagun's General History of the Things of New Spain, compiled over several decades in the 16th century, remains one of our most valuable sources of information about pre-Columbian Mexican civilization. Other missionaries focused on finding common ground between Christian and indigenous beliefs. They identified indigenous practices that seemed compatible with Christianity and built upon these foundations. The worship of local deities was often redirected toward Christian saints, and indigenous festivals were adapted to celebrate Christian holidays. The famous Shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico provides a perfect example of this syncretic approach. According to tradition, the Virgin Mary appeared to an indigenous man named Juan Diego in 1531, speaking to him in Nahuatl, and appearing with features that suggested both European and indigenous ancestry. The shrine established at the site of this apparition became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in the Americas and helped facilitate the conversion of millions of indigenous people to Christianity. The missionary enterprise was not without its critics, both among indigenous peoples and among the Spanish themselves. Some indigenous leaders saw the missionaries as agents of cultural destruction, attempting to eliminate traditional practices and beliefs that had sustained their communities for centuries. Some Spanish colonists viewed the friars as obstacles to their economic goals, particularly when missionaries defended indigenous rights or opposed exploitative labor practices. The tension between evangelization and indigenous rights was most prominently embodied in the figure of Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who became known as the defender of the Indians. Las Casas spent more than 50 years advocating for indigenous rights, writing extensive treatises documenting Spanish abuses, and proposing alternative models of colonization that would respect indigenous autonomy while promoting Christian conversion. Las Casas's most famous work, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, provided detailed descriptions of Spanish mistreatment of indigenous peoples, and argued that such practices were not only morally wrong, but also counterproductive to the goal of Christian conversion. His writings would later be used by Protestant countries to create the Black Legend of Spanish cruelty, but within Spain, they led to significant legal and policy reforms. The Spanish crown responded to missionary concerns by promulgating a series of laws designed to protect indigenous peoples while promoting their conversion to Christianity. The new laws of 1542 prohibited the enslavement of indigenous people, regulated the encomienda system, and required that all colonial officials respect indigenous rights as free persons and subjects of the Spanish crown. The missionaries also played crucial roles in education and cultural development throughout Spanish America. They established schools, colleges, and universities, created printing presses, and produced books in both Spanish and indigenous languages. The first book printed in the Americas was A Christian Doctrine in Spanish and Nahuatl, produced by missionary presses in Mexico City in 1539. Perhaps most importantly, the missionaries helped create new forms of art, architecture, and music that blended European and indigenous traditions. The Baroque churches of colonial Mexico and Peru, with their elaborate decorations and indigenous motifs, represent some of the finest achievements of colonial art. The music developed in mission communities, combining European polyphony with indigenous instruments and melodies, created entirely new musical traditions that continue to flourish today. The success of the missionary enterprise can be measured in various ways. By the end of the 16th century, millions of indigenous people throughout Spanish America had been baptized as Christians. New forms of religious expression had emerged that combined Christian and indigenous elements in creative and meaningful ways. Educational institutions had been established that would train indigenous and mestizo intellectuals for centuries to come. Yet the spiritual conquest was never complete in the sense that the missionaries had originally envisioned. Indigenous peoples often maintained traditional beliefs and practices alongside their new Christian identities, creating syncretic religious systems that were neither purely Christian nor purely indigenous, but something entirely new. This religious and cultural mixing would become one of the defining characteristics of Spanish-American civilization. Unlike other colonial systems that sought to maintain rigid separation between European and indigenous cultures, the Spanish Empire created space for cultural blending and synthesis. The result was not the replacement of indigenous cultures with European ones, but the creation of new forms of civilization that drew from both traditions. Chapter 7. The Viceroyalties Building an Imperial Administration. By the middle of the 16th century, Spanish territories in the Americas had grown far beyond what anyone in 1492 could have imagined. From the Caribbean islands where Columbus had first landed, Spanish dominion now extended across vast continental territories that encompassed dozens of indigenous empires, millions of people, and resources of almost unimaginable value. Managing this enormous empire required the development of new forms of government and administration on a scale never before attempted in human history. The Spanish response to this challenge was the creation of the viceroyalty system, a form of government that would endure for nearly 3 centuries and shape the development of Latin American society in fundamental ways. The viceroyalty represented an attempt to balance central control from Madrid with the practical necessities of governing distant territories, diverse populations, and complex economic systems. The first viceroyalty, New Spain, was established in 1535 with its capital at Mexico City, built literally on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. The choice of Mexico City as the viceregal capital was highly symbolic, demonstrating Spanish determination to create a new form of civilization that would incorporate but transcend indigenous achievements. The Cathedral of Mexico City was constructed using stones from the destroyed Aztec temples, physically embodying the cultural synthesis that characterized Spanish colonial society. Antonio de Mendoza, the first viceroy of New Spain, was a member of one of Spain's most distinguished noble families and had served with distinction in European wars before accepting his American appointment. His selection reflected the Spanish crown's recognition that governing American territories required men of the highest caliber and experience. The viceroy represented the person of the king himself and wielded virtually absolute authority within his jurisdiction. The viceroyalty of New Spain encompassed not only present-day Mexico, but also Central America, the Caribbean islands, the Philippines, and for a time, portions of what is now the southwestern United States. This vast territory included dozens of indigenous languages and cultures, varied geographical environments from tropical rainforests to high deserts, and economic systems ranging from subsistence agriculture to sophisticated mining operations. Mendoza proved to be an able administrator who established many of the institutions and practices that would characterize Spanish colonial government for centuries. He founded schools and hospitals, established regular communication routes between Mexico City and Madrid, and created administrative systems for collecting taxes, dispensing justice, and maintaining public order across vast distances. One of Mendoza's most important innovations was the development of a professional colonial bureaucracy staffed by educated men trained in Spanish law and administrative procedures. These officials, known as letrados, formed the backbone of colonial government and ensured some degree of consistency in administration across the empire's diverse territories. The second major viceroyalty, Peru, was established in 1542 with its capital at Lima. The Viceroyalty of Peru initially included all of Spanish South America, making it even larger than New Spain, and encompassing an even greater diversity of peoples and environments. The first Viceroy of Peru, Blasco Núñez Vela, faced the enormous challenge of imposing royal authority over conquistadors who had become accustomed to operating with considerable independence. Lima's location on the Pacific coast, rather than in the former Inca capital of Cusco high in the Andes, reflected the Spanish crown's priorities and strategic thinking. Lima provided better access to maritime communications with Spain and facilitated the development of Pacific trade routes that would eventually extend to the Philippines and Asia. The city was designed as a showcase of Spanish power and civilization, with broad avenues, imposing public buildings, and elaborate churches that demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of the Spanish Empire. The administration of Peru was complicated by the discovery of enormous silver deposits at Potosi in present-day Bolivia in 1545. The mountain of Potosi would produce more silver than any other location in human history, generating the wealth that financed Spanish global expansion for the next 2 centuries. But managing this vast mining operation required sophisticated administrative systems, large labor forces, and complex transportation networks to move silver from high Andean mines to coastal ports, and then across the Pacific or Atlantic to global markets. The Spanish developed the mita system to provide labor for the Potosi mines, a system based on pre-existing Inca practices of mandatory public service, but adapted to the needs of colonial mining. Under the mita, indigenous communities were required to provide a certain number of workers for specified periods to work in the mines. While this system was often harsh and exploitative, it also provided wages for indigenous workers and helped integrate indigenous communities into the colonial economy. The transportation of Potosi silver required the development of one of the world's most sophisticated logistical networks. Silver was carried by llama caravans from Potosi to the port of Arica on the Pacific coast, then shipped to Lima, and from there either across the Pacific to Manila and Asia, or overland across Panama to Caribbean ports for shipment to Spain. This network connected the high Andes to global markets and made Potosi silver a driving force in the world economy. The 2 original viceroyalties were eventually subdivided as Spanish territories continued to expand and administrative needs became more complex. The Viceroyalty of New Granada was created in 1717, encompassing present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. This division recognized the distinct character of northern South America and the practical difficulties of administering such vast territories from a single center. Finally, the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata was established in 1776, including present-day Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. The creation of this 4th viceroyalty reflected both the growing importance of Buenos Aires as a port city and the Spanish crown's desire to strengthen defenses against Portuguese expansion from Brazil. Each viceroyalty developed its own distinct character while remaining part of the broader Spanish imperial system. New Spain became known for its sophisticated urban culture, its universities and printing presses, and its complex racial mixing between Spanish, indigenous, and African populations. Peru was dominated by the wealth of Potosi silver, but also developed rich artistic and architectural traditions that blended European and indigenous elements in unique ways. The viceregal system represented a remarkable achievement in early modern government. The Spanish crown managed to maintain effective control over territories that stretched across multiple continents, encompassed dozens of languages and cultures, and included complex economic systems ranging from subsistence agriculture to global commerce. This was accomplished through a combination of centralized authority from Madrid and local adaptation to diverse conditions and populations. The legal foundation of viceregal government was provided by Spanish law, particularly the Recopilación de Leyes de los Reinos de las Indias, the comprehensive legal code that governed Spanish America. This code, compiled over many decades and revised multiple times, provided detailed regulations for everything from indigenous rights to commercial transactions, from ecclesiastical jurisdiction to military organization. But Spanish law was not simply imposed unchanged on American territories. Instead, it was adapted and modified to accommodate local conditions and indigenous practices. The principle of obedezco, pero no cumplo, I obey but do not comply, allowed colonial officials to acknowledge royal authority while adapting royal orders to local circumstances. This flexibility was essential to making the imperial system work across such vast and diverse territories. The viceregal courts, known as audiencias, served both as supreme judicial tribunals and as advisory councils to the viceroys. These institutions provided checks and balances within the colonial system, ensuring that no single official could wield unchecked power and providing avenues for appeals and grievances from colonial subjects. The economic foundation of the viceregal system was provided by a complex array of taxes, tribute payments, and commercial regulations. The famous treasure fleets that carried American silver to Spain were protected by elaborate convoy systems and represented the culmination of logistical planning that extended from individual mines in the Andes to royal treasuries in Seville. Yet the viceregal system was never purely extractive. Significant portions of American wealth remained in the colonies, funding the construction of churches, universities, and public works that created some of the most impressive urban centers in the world. Cities like Mexico City, Lima, and later Buenos Aires became centers of learning, art, and culture that rivaled their European counterparts. Chapter 8. Across the Pacific, the Philippines and Asian Connections. While Spanish conquistadors were establishing their empire in the Americas, Spanish explorers and administrators were also looking westward across the Pacific Ocean, seeking to extend their dominion into Asia and to establish the trade routes that would make their empire truly global. The conquest and colonization of the Philippines would complete the Spanish Empire's transformation into the first genuinely worldwide imperial system in human history. Spanish interest in Asian trade was not new. Columbus's original voyage had been motivated by the desire to reach the spice markets of the Indies, and even after the discovery of America, Spanish leaders continued to dream of accessing the wealth of Asia. The Portuguese had already established their presence in the Indian Ocean and had reached the Spice Islands, but the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, had theoretically divided the world between Spain and Portugal, leaving open the question of which power would control the Philippines and other Western Pacific territories. The Spanish approach to the Pacific came not from Europe, but from their American territories. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa had crossed the Isthmus of Panama and become the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the American side. This discovery opened up the possibility of reaching Asia by sailing west from America, potentially making Spanish America a bridge between European and Asian markets. The first serious Spanish attempt to cross the Pacific was led by Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator sailing in Spanish service. Magellan's expedition, which departed from Spain in 1519, represented one of the most ambitious voyages in human history, an attempt to reach the Spice Islands by sailing westward around the world. Magellan's voyage was a testament to Spanish determination and global vision. After crossing the Atlantic and navigating the treacherous strait at the southern tip of South America that would bear his name, the expedition entered the Pacific Ocean and faced the enormous challenge of crossing the world's largest ocean with only primitive navigation equipment and limited supplies. The Pacific crossing took 99 days, during which the expedition encountered no land except for a few small, uninhabited islands. Men died of scurvy and starvation, and by the time they reached Guam in the Mariana Islands, they were in desperate condition. From Guam, they continued to the Philippines, where Magellan was killed in a battle with local forces on the island of Mactan in April 1521. Despite Magellan's death, his expedition had demonstrated that the Pacific could be crossed, and that the Philippines were accessible from Spanish America. More importantly, the surviving members of the expedition continued westward, eventually reaching Spain in 1522, thus completing the first circumnavigation of the globe and proving definitively that the Earth was a sphere. But establishing regular communication and trade across the Pacific would prove far more challenging than a single voyage of exploration. It was not until 1564 that Miguel López de Legazpi successfully established permanent Spanish settlements in the Philippines, founding the city of Manila in 1571 and creating the administrative structures that would govern the islands for the next 3 centuries. The conquest of the Philippines differed significantly from Spanish expansion in the Americas. The Philippine archipelago consisted of more than 7,000 islands with hundreds of distinct ethnic groups speaking dozens of different languages. Unlike Mexico and Peru, which had been dominated by centralized empires that the Spanish could capture and redirect, the Philippines had no unified political structure that could be easily taken over. Instead, the Spanish had to negotiate with hundreds of individual chieftains and communities, many of which had never been in contact with each other. This process required enormous patience, diplomatic skill, and cultural sensitivity. The Spanish succeeded largely because they were able to position themselves as protectors and allies, rather than simply as conquerors. The Spanish also benefited from their experience in the Americas in dealing with diverse indigenous populations. They applied lessons learned about cultural adaptation, religious conversion, and administrative flexibility to their Philippine territories. The encomienda system was established in the Philippines, but in modified form that took account of existing political structures and customs. Religious conversion proved to be particularly successful in the Philippines. Unlike many indigenous American populations, who had sophisticated theological systems that were resistant to Christian influence, many Philippine communities practiced animistic religions that were more easily adapted to Catholic Christianity. The Spanish missionaries, particularly the Augustinians and later the Jesuits, made rapid progress in converting the Philippine population to Christianity. The establishment of Spanish rule in the Philippines created the final link in a global trading network that connected Europe, America, and Asia in unprecedented ways. Manila became the western terminus of a trade route that began in Europe, crossed the Atlantic to America, continued overland across Mexico or Panama, and then crossed the Pacific to the Philippines. This trans-Pacific trade was facilitated by the famous Manila galleons, large, heavily armed ships that sailed annually between Manila and Acapulco, carrying Asian goods to America and American silver to Asia. The galleon trade represented one of the earliest examples of truly global commerce, connecting Chinese silk and porcelain, Philippine textiles, Indian spices, and American silver in a trading network that spanned 3 oceans. The Manila galleons were among the largest ships in the world at the time, designed to carry enormous cargoes over vast distances. The voyage from Manila to Acapulco typically took 4 to 6 months, crossing thousands of miles of open ocean with only primitive navigation equipment. The return voyage, taking advantage of different wind patterns, usually took only 2 to 3 months. The galleon trade had profound effects on all the regions it connected. American silver became the currency of Asian markets, stimulating economic growth throughout China, India, and Southeast Asia. Asian goods, silk, porcelain, spices, and luxury items became available in American and European markets, influencing fashion, cuisine, and material culture throughout the Spanish Empire. In the Philippines themselves, the galleon trade created a unique form of colonial economy that was more commercial and less extractive than Spanish America. Unlike Mexico and Peru, which were valued primarily for their mineral wealth, the Philippines served as a trading hub where goods from throughout Asia were collected for shipment to America and Europe. Manila developed into one of the world's great cosmopolitan cities, home to Spanish administrators, Chinese merchants, Japanese traders, Indian financiers, and Filipino artisans. The city's population was remarkably diverse, and its culture reflected the mixing of European, American, and Asian influences that characterized the Spanish Empire at its height. The Spanish presence in the Philippines also had important strategic implications for their American territories. Manila served as a forward base for defending the western approaches to Spanish America against potential Asian rivals, particularly the Dutch, who were expanding their influence throughout Southeast Asia. The Philippines also became a source of valuable tropical products that supplemented American production. Philippine tobacco, sugar, and textiles found markets throughout the Spanish Empire, while Philippine shipbuilders, using local hardwoods and traditional techniques, produced some of the finest ships in the Spanish fleet. Perhaps most importantly, the Philippines represented the culmination of Spanish global vision. With territories stretching from Spain to the Philippines, the Spanish Empire could legitimately claim to be the first empire on which the sun never set. Spanish administrators in Manila could send reports that would travel westward through Asia, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and finally reach Madrid, while similar reports could travel eastward across the Pacific, through America, across the Atlantic, and arrive in Madrid from the opposite direction. This global reach gave Spain enormous advantages in international trade and diplomacy. Spanish knowledge of global conditions, gained through their worldwide network of territories and trading posts, made them invaluable allies and dangerous enemies. Information gathered in Manila about Chinese politics could influence Spanish policy in Europe, while developments in European wars could affect Spanish strategy in Asia. The Spanish Empire had achieved something unprecedented in human history, a truly global empire that functioned as an integrated political and economic system. From the silver mines of Potosi to the trading houses of Manila, from the universities of Mexico City to the churches of Lima, Spanish territories formed a network that connected all the inhabited continents and created the first global civilization. As our first part of this journey through Spanish imperial history draws to a close, we can see how a collection of medieval kingdoms had transformed itself into the dominant global power of the early modern world. Through a combination of strategic marriages, bold exploration, skillful diplomacy, and cultural adaptation, Spain had created an empire that would endure for 3 centuries and leave lasting impacts on every continent it touched. And so concludes our first exploration of the Spanish Empire's rise from a collection of unified kingdoms to a global dominion that spanned the world. We have witnessed the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand, the completion of the Reconquista, Columbus's world-changing voyage, and the establishment of settlements that would grow into vast viceroyalties. We have seen how Spanish success came not through simple conquest, but through alliances with indigenous peoples who saw the Spanish as potential liberators from oppressive empires. We have observed how missionaries and administrators worked to create new forms of civilization that blended European, indigenous, and later African elements into something entirely new. And we have followed Spanish ambitions across the Pacific to the Philippines, where the empire completed its global reach and established trading networks that connected Europe, America, and Asia in unprecedented ways. But this is only the beginning of our story. In our next part, we will explore how this global empire was administered and maintained, how it adapted to challenges and crises, and how it evolved over 3 centuries of existence. We will see how Spanish America developed its own distinctive forms of art, literature, and learning, and how the empire dealt with the growing challenges of the 17th and 18th centuries. Until then, rest well, and let your dreams carry you across the oceans and continents of this remarkable empire, where the sun never set. The Spanish Empire, Administration, Wealth, and Golden Age. Chapter 9. The Machinery of Empire Imperial Administration. As dawn breaks over the vast territories of the Spanish Empire, from the bustling ports of Seville to the silver mines of Potosi, from the universities of Mexico City to the trading houses of Manila, we witness the daily operation of the most complex administrative system the world had ever known. The Spanish Empire's endurance for over 3 centuries was not merely the result of military conquest or economic exploitation, but of sophisticated governmental institutions that managed to coordinate policy across unprecedented distances, while adapting to local conditions and cultures. At the heart of this administrative marvel stood 2 institutions that would define Spanish imperial governance for centuries: the Council of the Indies and the Casa de Contratación. These bodies, created in the early 16th century, represented revolutionary approaches to colonial administration that recognized both the unique challenges of governing distant territories and the moral obligations that came with dominion over diverse populations. The Casa de Contratación, established in Seville in 1503, was perhaps the world's first comprehensive agency for colonial commerce and navigation. Created just 11 years after Columbus's first voyage, it reflected the Spanish crown's early recognition that the new American territories would require specialized administrative attention beyond traditional European governmental structures. The Casa served simultaneously as a commercial regulatory agency, a navigation school, a judicial court, and a communications center. All trade between Spain and the Americas was required to pass through its oversight, ensuring that the Crown received its share of colonial revenues while maintaining detailed records of every ship, every cargo, and every passenger that crossed the Atlantic. Within the Casa's elegant halls in Seville, cartographers worked to map the expanding boundaries of Spanish dominion, incorporating the latest reports from explorers and administrators across the empire. The Casa maintained the most comprehensive collection of maps and navigation charts in the world, closely guarded secrets that gave Spain enormous advantages in global trade and exploration. The Council of the Indies, established in 1524, represented an even more ambitious attempt to govern distant territories through centralized institutions. Unlike the Casa, which focused primarily on commercial matters, the council served as the supreme governing body for all Spanish territories in the Americas and Asia, wielding executive, legislative, and judicial authority over an empire that spanned 3 oceans. The council's 24 members, typically lawyers and churchmen with extensive experience in colonial affairs, met regularly in Madrid to consider everything from major policy questions to individual legal appeals from colonial subjects. They appointed viceroys and governors, reviewed colonial legislation, heard judicial appeals, and served as the final authority on questions of colonial law and administration. What made the Council of the Indies remarkable was not just its scope of authority, but its commitment to detailed legal oversight of colonial administration. Every major decision by colonial officials was subject to review by the Council, and colonial subjects, including indigenous people, had the right to appeal local decisions to the Council's jurisdiction. The Council also served as a legislative body, promulgating the comprehensive legal code known as the Laws of the Indies. This massive collection of legislation, begun in 1542 and expanded continuously over the following centuries, represented one of history's most ambitious attempts to govern diverse populations under a unified legal system while respecting local customs and rights. The Laws of the Indies were remarkable for their recognition of indigenous peoples as free subjects of the Spanish crown with specific rights and protections. Unlike other colonial legal systems that often treated indigenous peoples as obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited, Spanish law recognized indigenous communities as legitimate political entities with rights to their traditional lands, customs, and forms of self-government. These laws prohibited the enslavement of indigenous people, required that they be paid for their labor, mandated that they receive religious instruction in their own languages, and established elaborate procedures for protecting them from exploitation by Spanish colonists. While these protections were often imperfectly enforced, their very existence in Spanish law marked a significant departure from the practices of other colonial powers. The day-to-day administration of the empire was carried out by a hierarchy of officials that extended from the viceroys at the top to local municipal councils at the bottom. The viceroys, as personal representatives of the king, wielded enormous authority within their jurisdictions, but they were also subject to complex checks and balances designed to prevent abuse of power. The audiencias, or high courts, served both as supreme judicial tribunals and as advisory councils to the viceroys. These institutions provided crucial oversight of viceregal authority and served as courts of appeal for colonial subjects seeking redress against local officials. The audiencias also conducted residentias, formal investigations of outgoing officials that helped maintain standards of honest administration throughout the empire. At the local level, Spanish colonial administration relied heavily on cabildos, municipal councils that governed individual cities and towns. These institutions, modeled on traditional Spanish municipal government, provided representation for local residents and administered everything from public works to market regulations to law enforcement. What made the cabildo system particularly interesting was its inclusiveness. While initially dominated by Spanish colonists, cabildos gradually incorporated mestizo and even indigenous members, particularly in areas where these populations were numerous. This gradual inclusion of non-European populations in colonial government was unique among early modern empires and helped create loyalty to Spanish rule among diverse colonial populations. The Spanish administrative system also recognized the importance of indigenous political structures and often worked through existing hierarchies, rather than attempting to replace them entirely. Indigenous nobles retained many of their traditional privileges and responsibilities, serving as intermediaries between Spanish colonial government and indigenous communities. This collaborative approach to colonial administration was formalized in the institution of the República de Indios, a parallel governmental structure that allowed indigenous communities to maintain their own laws, customs, and authorities while remaining subject to Spanish sovereignty. Indigenous communities elected their own officials, maintained their own treasuries, and administered their own legal systems for internal disputes. The administrative complexity of the Spanish Empire was further enhanced by the central role played by the Catholic Church. Unlike other colonial systems where religious authority was subordinate to civil government, in the Spanish Empire, the Church wielded significant independent authority and served as a crucial partner in colonial administration. Spanish law required that all indigenous peoples be offered conversion to Christianity, and the Church took this mandate seriously, establishing missions, schools, and hospitals throughout the empire. Church officials often served as advocates for indigenous rights and provided alternative channels for grievances and appeals when civil authorities proved unresponsive. The coordination of this vast administrative system required sophisticated communication networks that connected Madrid to the farthest reaches of the empire. Regular courier services carried official correspondence between Spain and the Americas, while the annual treasure fleets provided opportunities for more extensive communications between colonial officials and their superiors in Spain. The Spanish postal system, established in the 16th century, was among the world's most extensive and reliable, maintaining regular service between major cities throughout the empire. Letters sent from Madrid could reach Mexico City in 4 to 6 months, Lima in 8 to 10 months, and Manila in over a year. But the reliability of these communications allowed for coordinated policy implementation across vast distances. Perhaps most remarkably, the Spanish administrative system managed to maintain unity and coherence across territories that encompassed dozens of languages, cultures, and economic systems. This achievement required not rigid uniformity, but rather flexible adaptation of general principles to local conditions, a balance that the Spanish managed better than any other early modern empire. The success of Spanish imperial administration can be measured not just in its longevity, but in the degree to which it created lasting institutions and legal traditions that continue to influence the modern world. The civil law tradition that predominates in Latin America today, the urban planning principles that shaped colonial cities, and the legal concepts that govern indigenous rights all trace their origins to the administrative innovations of the Spanish Empire. Chapter 10. The Silver Stream's Economic Foundations of Global Power. In the high Andes of what is now Bolivia, at an altitude where the air is thin and the cold bites through the warmest clothing, stands a mountain that changed the world. Cerro Rico, the rich hill at Potosi, discovered in 1545, would produce more silver than any other location in human history, generating the wealth that would finance Spanish global dominance for the next 2 centuries and fundamentally transform the global economy. The discovery of silver at Potosi was, like so many pivotal moments in Spanish colonial history, the result of both careful planning and remarkable fortune. Spanish prospectors, working with indigenous guides who knew the local geography intimately, had been searching for precious metals throughout the Andes since the conquest of the Inca Empire. The techniques they used combined European mining knowledge with indigenous expertise about local conditions and ore deposits. According to legend, the silver veins at Potosi were discovered by an indigenous man named Diego Hualpa, who noticed the unusual weight of a rock he had picked up while tending his llamas. When Spanish prospectors investigated his find, they realized they had discovered what would prove to be the richest silver deposit ever found. But Potosi was only part of a broader pattern of mineral discovery that would transform Spanish America into the world's primary source of precious metals. In 1546, just 1 year after the Potosi discovery, Spanish prospectors found major silver deposits at Zacatecas in northern Mexico. These twin discoveries ensured that Spanish America would dominate global silver production for centuries to come. The scale of silver production at these mines was almost beyond comprehension. At its peak, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Potosi alone was producing over 200 tons of silver, annually more than the rest of the world combined. The mountain was so rich that contemporaries claimed it could have built a silver bridge from Potosi to Madrid, and the city that grew up around the mines became one of the largest and wealthiest in the world. By 1600, the city of Potosi had a population of over 160,000 people, making it larger than London, Paris, or Rome. The city was a cosmopolitan metropolis that attracted people from throughout the Spanish Empire, and beyond Spanish administrators and merchants, indigenous miners and farmers, African slaves, Portuguese traders, and even Chinese artisans who had arrived via the Pacific trade routes. The wealth generated by Potosi and other Spanish-American mines was not simply extracted and shipped to Europe. Significant portions remained in the Americas, funding the construction of some of the world's most magnificent churches, palaces, and public buildings. The Baroque architecture of colonial Mexico and Peru, with its elaborate decorations and precious metal ornamentation, was made possible by the silver wealth of the Americas. The transportation of this silver to global markets required the development of sophisticated logistical networks that connected remote mountain mines to ports and shipping routes. From Potosi, silver was carried by llama caravans down treacherous mountain paths to the Pacific port of Arica, then shipped north to Lima, where it entered the global trading system that connected America with Europe and Asia. The famous Spanish treasure fleets, the Flota de Indias, represented one of the most ambitious and successful commercial enterprises in history. These heavily armed convoys, sailing on carefully timed schedules between Spanish-American ports and Spain, carried the silver that would finance Spanish global power, while also transporting goods, people, and information that connected the Spanish Empire's far-flung territories. The treasure fleets operated on a complex schedule that took advantage of seasonal wind patterns and coordinated with silver production cycles in the Americas. 2 main fleets sailed annually from Spain, one bound for Mexico and Central America, the other for northern South America. These fleets would then rendezvous in Havana before returning to Spain together, their combined firepower providing protection against pirates and foreign naval forces. The scale of these operations was enormous. A typical treasure fleet might consist of 30 to 40 ships carrying not only silver and gold, but also American products like cacao, tobacco, and exotic woods, as well as Asian goods that had reached America via the trans-Pacific trade routes. The return voyage to America would carry European-manufactured goods, books, wine, and luxury items that supplied the needs of colonial society. Seville, as the designated terminus for all American trade, became one of Europe's wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities. The Casa de Contratacion's strict regulations ensured that all American silver passed through Seville's ports, creating enormous wealth for the city's merchants, bankers, and artisans. Later, as shipping patterns evolved, Cadiz would inherit this role and become the new center of Spanish global commerce. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Spanish silver trade was its truly global reach. The establishment of regular trans-Pacific commerce via the Manila galleons meant that American silver flowed not only to Europe but also to Asia, where it became the preferred currency for trade throughout China, India, and Southeast Asia. The Manila galleon trade created the world's first truly global currency system. Spanish pieces of 8, minted from American silver, became the standard medium of exchange from Beijing to Boston, from London to Lima. The reliability and purity of Spanish silver made it universally acceptable, and its abundance ensured that global trade could expand to unprecedented levels. The economic impact of Spanish silver extended far beyond the Spanish Empire itself. European prices rose dramatically throughout the 16th and 17th centuries as American silver increased the money supply, leading to what economists call the price revolution. This inflation had complex effects, benefiting some groups while harming others, but it also stimulated economic growth and technological innovation throughout Europe. In Asia, American silver enabled the expansion of Chinese manufacturing and Indian textile production by providing the currency needed for large-scale commercial transactions. Chinese demand for silver was particularly intense because China's tax system required payment in silver, creating a massive market for American precious metals that helped drive global trade patterns. The Spanish crown's share of this silver wealth, typically 1/5 of all production, provided the financial foundation for Spanish global power. This revenue, known as the Quinto Real, financed Spanish armies in Europe, supported the Spanish Navy's protection of global trade routes, and funded the construction of the elaborate governmental infrastructure that administered the Spanish Empire. But Spanish silver wealth was not simply hoarded in royal treasuries. Much of it was immediately reinvested in global commerce, funding trading expeditions, supporting colonial development, and purchasing Asian goods that were then redistributed throughout the Spanish Empire. This circulation of silver created multiplier effects that stimulated economic activity throughout the empire and beyond. The mining operations themselves required enormous investments in infrastructure and technology. The development of the patio process for silver refining, which used mercury to extract silver from low-grade ores, revolutionized mining efficiency and allowed Spanish America to maintain its dominance in global silver production, even as the richest surface deposits were exhausted. The environmental and human costs of this silver production were enormous. Mercury poisoning affected thousands of miners, while the demands of mining disrupted traditional agricultural patterns and social structures throughout the Andes. The Mita labor system, while providing wages for indigenous workers, also imposed heavy burdens on indigenous communities and contributed to population decline in some regions. Yet the silver economy also created opportunities for indigenous people to participate in the global economy in ways that had not previously existed. Indigenous merchants and artisans found markets for their products throughout the Spanish Empire, while indigenous laborers, despite harsh working conditions, earned wages that allowed them to purchase European and Asian goods. The integration of indigenous peoples into the silver economy also had important cultural effects. Indigenous communities developed new forms of art and craftsmanship that incorporated European and Asian influences while maintaining traditional techniques and aesthetics. The silverwork of colonial Mexico and Peru, much of it created by indigenous artisans, represents some of the finest artistic achievement of the colonial period. The Spanish silver trade also fostered the development of sophisticated financial institutions that facilitated global commerce. Spanish merchants developed new forms of credit, insurance, and currency exchange that allowed for commercial transactions across vast distances and different monetary systems. These innovations laid the foundation for modern international banking and finance. Perhaps most importantly, the silver wealth of Spanish America demonstrated that enormous riches could be generated through the development of colonial territories, rather than simply through their exploitation. The Spanish approach of investing in colonial infrastructure, protecting colonial populations, and developing local economies proved more sustainable than simple extractive colonialism and helped ensure the longevity of Spanish imperial dominance. The flow of silver from American mines to global markets continued for over 2 centuries, making Spanish America the driving force of the early modern global economy. Even as other powers challenged Spanish dominance in Europe, the wealth of American silver continued to provide the financial foundation for Spanish global influence and cultural achievement. Chapter 11. The Flowering of Genius, Spain's Golden Age of Culture and Science. In the shadow of the Escorial, Philip Roman II's magnificent palace and monastery outside Madrid, and in the bustling streets of Seville, where ships from 3 continents brought news of distant lands, an extraordinary cultural renaissance was taking shape. The Spain of the late 16th and early 17th centuries witnessed an explosion of artistic, literary, and intellectual achievement that paralleled, and in many ways surpassed the better-known Italian Renaissance. This golden age, the Siglo de Oro, was not merely a Spanish phenomenon, but a truly imperial cultural flowering that extended from the universities of Salamanca to the colonial capitals of Mexico City and Lima, from the churches of Seville to the missions of the Philippines. The wealth flowing from American silver mines provided the financial foundation for this cultural explosion, but its origins lay deeper in the confidence and cosmopolitan outlook that came from governing the world's first global empire. At the heart of this cultural renaissance stood a figure whose name would become synonymous with Spanish literary genius, Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Born in 1547 into a family of modest means, Cervantes embodied the global reach and complex experiences of the Spanish Empire. He served as a soldier in the Mediterranean, fighting against Ottoman forces at the Battle of Lepanto, where he lost the use of his left hand, a wound he would proudly call the greatest occasion that past or present ages have seen. Cervantes spent 5 years as a captive in Algiers, an experience that exposed him to the cultural complexity of the Mediterranean world and the porous boundaries between Christian and Islamic civilizations. When he finally returned to Spain, he worked as a tax collector in Andalusia, traveling throughout the region and encountering the full diversity of Spanish society: nobles and peasants, Christians and converted Muslims, merchants and bandits. All of these experiences found their way into his masterwork, Don Quixote de la Mancha, published in 2 parts in 1605 and 1615. This novel, often considered the first modern European novel, was far more than a simple satire of chivalric romances. It was a profound meditation on reality and imagination, on the nature of heroism in a changing world, and on the complex relationship between idealism and pragmatism that characterized the Spanish Empire itself. Don Quixote's impossible quest to revive knight-errantry in an age of gunpowder and global commerce can be read as a metaphor for Spain's own position in the early 17th century, a nation attempting to maintain medieval ideals of honor and religious mission in an increasingly complex and secular world. Yet Cervantes' treatment of his protagonist was neither purely satirical nor entirely sympathetic. Like the Spanish Empire itself, Don Quixote was both admirable and absurd, noble and naive, successful and self-defeating. The novel's immediate success was extraordinary. Within a few years of its publication, Don Quixote was being read throughout Europe and had been translated into major European languages. Pirated editions appeared as far away as colonial Mexico, where the novel was eagerly read despite official prohibitions on fictional literature in the colonies. But Cervantes was only one star in a constellation of literary brilliance that illuminated the Spanish Golden Age. Lope de Vega, often called the Phoenix of Spanish literature, wrote more than 1,500 plays and countless poems, sonnets, and novels. His productivity was legendary. Even in his own time, contemporaries claimed he could write a play in a single day, and his works were performed throughout the Spanish Empire, from Madrid to Manila. Lope's plays captured the full range of Spanish experience, from historical dramas celebrating the heroic deeds of Spanish conquistadors to comedies of manners that explored the complexities of honor, love, and social mobility in imperial society. His work, Fuente Ovejuna, about a village that rises up against an oppressive lord, explored themes of justice and collective action that resonated throughout the Spanish Empire, where similar tensions between authority and popular resistance played out across 3 continents. Pedro Calderón de la Barca brought Spanish drama to even greater heights of philosophical and poetic sophistication. His plays, including the masterpiece Life is a Dream, explored profound questions about reality, free will, and the nature of human existence with a depth and complexity that rivaled the greatest philosophical works of the age. Calderón's plays were performed not only in the commercial theaters of Madrid and Seville, but also in the elaborate court festivals that celebrated royal occasions. These performances, with their spectacular staging, elaborate costumes, and musical accompaniment, represented some of the most sophisticated theatrical productions in Europe and helped establish Spanish drama as the dominant theatrical form of the 17th century. The visual arts of Golden Age Spain were equally remarkable. Domenico's Theotokopoulos, known as El Greco, brought a mystical intensity to religious painting that captured the spiritual fervor of Counter-Reformation Catholicism, while incorporating influences from his Greek origins and Italian training. His elongated figures and otherworldly colors created a distinctive style that was uniquely Spanish, while remaining cosmopolitanly influenced. Diego Velázquez, court painter to Philip Roman IV, achieved a mastery of technique and psychological insight that established him as one of history's greatest artists. His painting Las Meninas, with its complex play of perspective and reality, has been called the greatest painting ever created. But Velázquez's genius extended beyond technique to encompass a profound understanding of human dignity that is evident in all his portraits, from kings and nobles to servants and dwarfs. Francisco de Zurbarán brought a mystical realism to religious painting that perfectly captured the spiritual intensity of Spanish Catholicism. His paintings of monks and saints, with their dramatic lighting and sculptural solidity, created some of the most powerful religious art of the Baroque period. Meanwhile, Bartolomé Esteban Murillo's gentler style, with its emphasis on beauty and emotion, made him one of the most popular painters in Europe and helped spread Spanish artistic influence throughout the continent. The architectural achievements of Golden Age Spain were equally impressive. The distinctive Spanish Baroque style, which combined classical European elements with influences from Islamic Spain and the Americas, created some of the world's most spectacular buildings. The churches and palaces of this period, with their elaborate decorations and innovative spatial arrangements, established architectural principles that would influence building throughout the Spanish Empire. Perhaps even more importantly, Spanish architects and urban planners developed the grid system of city planning that would shape the development of hundreds of cities throughout the Americas. The Spanish colonial city, with its central plaza surrounded by cathedral, government buildings, and aristocratic residences, created a template for urban development that remains influential today. The intellectual achievements of Golden Age Spain were equally remarkable. The School of Salamanca, centered at the ancient university of that city, produced some of the most important legal and philosophical thinkers of the early modern period. Francisco de Vitoria, often called the father of international law, developed sophisticated theories about the rights of nations and the legitimate basis for war that continue to influence international relations today. Vitoria's lectures on the Spanish conquest of America grappled seriously with questions about the rights of indigenous peoples and the moral obligations of imperial powers. His conclusion that indigenous peoples possess natural rights that must be respected by colonial authorities helped establish legal principles that, while imperfectly enforced, represented significant advances in thinking about human rights and cultural diversity. The Jesuit political philosopher Juan de Mariana developed theories about popular sovereignty and the right of resistance to tyranny that influenced political thought throughout Europe. His work, The King and the Education of the King, argued that royal authority was limited by natural law and popular consent, ideas that would later influence democratic movements throughout the Western world. Spanish contributions to science and technology were equally significant. Spanish navigators and cartographers produced the most accurate maps and navigation charts of their time, while Spanish physicians and naturalists made important discoveries about New World plants and animals that expanded European understanding of natural history. The establishment of universities in Mexico City and Lima in 1551 represented the extension of European higher education to the Americas for the first time. These institutions, modeled on the University of Salamanca, offered instruction in theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts to students from throughout the Spanish Empire. Indigenous students were welcomed alongside Spanish and Mestizo students, creating the first truly multiracial institutions of higher education in the Americas. The printing presses established in Mexico City, Lima, and other colonial cities produced books in indigenous languages as well as Spanish, helping to preserve and develop native literary traditions while also spreading European learning throughout the Americas. The first book printed in the Americas, A Christian Catechism in Spanish and Nahuatl, symbolized the cultural synthesis that characterized Spanish imperial civilization. Perhaps most remarkably, the Golden Age produced a distinctively Spanish form of mystical literature that combined deep religious devotion with literary sophistication. Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross created prose and poetry that captured the intensity of mystical experience while maintaining the highest standards of literary excellence. Their works were read throughout the Catholic world and helped establish Spanish as a major language of religious and philosophical expression. The cultural achievements of Golden Age Spain were not confined to elite circles, but permeated all levels of society. Popular festivals, religious processions, and theatrical performances brought art and literature to ordinary people throughout the empire, while the visual arts decorated churches, public buildings, and private homes in ways that made aesthetic experience part of daily life. This cultural flowering was made possible by the wealth and confidence that came from global empire, but it also reflected deeper Spanish values about the importance of honor, dignity, and spiritual life. The Spanish Golden Age represented not just an artistic renaissance, but a comprehensive vision of human civilization that integrated material prosperity with spiritual development, individual achievement with collective identity, and local traditions with global perspectives. The influence of Golden Age Spanish culture extended far beyond the Spanish Empire itself. Spanish literature, art, and ideas influenced cultural development throughout Europe, while the distinctive colonial culture that emerged in Spanish America created new forms of artistic expression that blended European, indigenous, and African influences in unprecedented ways. As we witness this remarkable cultural flowering, we see how the Spanish Empire at its height was not merely a political and economic system, but a comprehensive civilization that encouraged human creativity and achievement on a global scale. The wealth flowing from American mines and Asian trade provided the material foundation for this cultural renaissance, but its deepest sources lay in the Spanish capacity to create unity from diversity and to maintain high ideals while adapting to practical necessities. Chapter 12. Cities of Splendor, Urban Planning and Colonial Architecture. Across the vast territories of the Spanish Empire, from the rebuilt magnificence of Mexico City to the carefully planned streets of Lima, from the fortress cities of the Caribbean to the trading centers of the Philippines, a distinctive form of urban civilization was taking shape. Spanish colonial cities represented more than mere administrative centers or commercial hubs. They were physical embodiments of a comprehensive vision of imperial civilization that sought to create order, beauty, and cultural synthesis on a global scale. The Spanish approach to city planning was revolutionary for its time. Unlike the organic growth that characterized most medieval European cities, Spanish colonial cities were designed according to systematic principles laid out in the laws of the Indies. These regulations, refined over decades of colonial experience, required that new cities be established according to a grid pattern with a central plaza surrounded by the most important civic and religious buildings. This urban planning system reflected both practical and philosophical considerations. The grid pattern facilitated administration, commerce, and defense, while the central plaza created a focal point for civic life that encouraged social interaction across racial and class lines. The requirement that the cathedral, government buildings, and principal residences face the central plaza symbolically represented the integration of religious, political, and social authority that characterized Spanish imperial ideology. Mexico City, built literally on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, represented the most ambitious urban project of the colonial period. Spanish architects and engineers, working with indigenous laborers who possessed sophisticated knowledge of local conditions and building techniques, created a city that surpassed its European contemporaries in both scale and magnificence. The Cathedral of Mexico City, begun in 1573 and completed over 2 centuries later, represented one of the most ambitious architectural projects in the Americas. Its massive scale and elaborate decoration demonstrated the wealth and artistic sophistication of New Spain, while its incorporation of indigenous artistic motifs symbolized the cultural synthesis that characterized Spanish colonial civilization. The cathedral's construction required the collaboration of Spanish architects trained in European traditions, indigenous craftsmen who possessed centuries of experience in stonework and decoration, and African artisans who contributed their own distinctive techniques and aesthetic sensibilities. The result was a building that was recognizably Catholic and European in its overall conception, while incorporating decorative elements and construction techniques that reflected the diverse cultural heritage of colonial society. The Palace of the Viceroys, facing the cathedral across the central plaza, represented civil authority with equal magnificence. Its elaborate facade and spacious courtyards provided a suitable setting for the ceremonies and receptions that marked the viceregal court, while its defensive features reflected the practical necessities of governing a diverse and sometimes restive population. But Mexico City's greatest achievement may have been its comprehensive urban infrastructure. The city's elaborate system of canals, bridges, and causeways, managed water supply and drainage in the challenging environment of the former Lake Texcoco, while its wide streets and regular blocks facilitated both commerce and administration. The city's markets, hospitals, schools, and religious institutions created a comprehensive urban environment that served the needs of a diverse population numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Lima, founded by Francisco Pizarro in 1535, represented a different but equally impressive approach to colonial city planning. Unlike Mexico City, which was built on the site of an existing indigenous capital, Lima was created as an entirely new city designed from the beginning according to Spanish urban planning principles. Lima's location on the Pacific coast reflected the Spanish crown's strategic priorities and global vision. The city served not only as the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, but also as the western terminus of trade routes that connected South America with Asia via the Manila galleons. This global commercial role was reflected in Lima's architecture and urban design, which incorporated influences from Europe, Asia, and indigenous America in distinctive ways. The palace of the viceroys in Lima rivaled those of European capitals in its magnificence, while the city's numerous churches and convents represented some of the finest Baroque architecture in the Americas. The distinctive Lima Baroque style, with its elaborate wooden balconies and earthquake-resistant construction techniques, created an architectural tradition that influenced building throughout the Pacific coast of South America. Lima's University, founded in 1551, was among the oldest in the Americas and quickly became a center of learning that attracted students from throughout the Spanish Empire. The university's library, with its comprehensive collection of European and American works, served scholars and administrators throughout South America and helped maintain intellectual connections between the colonies and Europe. The smaller cities of Spanish America were equally impressive in their own ways. Puebla in Mexico, founded in 1531, was planned as a model Spanish city populated entirely by Spanish colonists. Its regular grid pattern, magnificent churches, and distinctive tilework created an urban environment that seemed to transplant a piece of Spain to the Mexican highlands. Cusco, the former capital of the Inca Empire, represented a different approach to colonial urban development. Rather than completely rebuilding the city, Spanish administrators chose to preserve many existing Inca structures while adding Spanish buildings and adapting the urban layout to Spanish needs. The result was a unique urban environment that visibly represented the cultural synthesis of colonial Peru. The churches of Cusco, built on the foundations of Inca temples and incorporating massive stone blocks from earlier structures, created a distinctive architectural style that blended European and indigenous traditions. The cathedral, built partly on the site of the Inca temple of Viracocha, symbolized the religious transformation of Peru, while acknowledging the sophisticated architectural achievements of pre-Columbian civilization. Spanish colonial cities in the Caribbean developed their own distinctive characteristics that reflected their role as commercial and military centers in the global Spanish Empire. Havana, with its massive fortifications and excellent harbor, became the gathering point for the treasure fleets that carried American silver to Europe. The city's architecture reflected its military importance, with thick-walled buildings designed to withstand both hurricanes and enemy attacks. Santo Domingo, the first European city in the Americas, continued to serve as an important administrative and commercial center throughout the colonial period. Its cathedral, completed in 1540, was the first cathedral in the Americas and established architectural precedents that influenced church construction throughout Spanish America. The cities of the Philippines represented the easternmost extension of Spanish urban planning principles. Manila, founded in 1571, was designed according to the same grid pattern used throughout Spanish America, but its architecture incorporated Asian influences that reflected the city's role as a center of trans-Pacific commerce. The churches of Manila, built by Spanish friars with the assistance of Chinese and Filipino craftsmen, created a distinctive architectural style that blended European, Chinese, and indigenous Philippine elements. These buildings, with their elaborate wooden decorations and earthquake-resistant construction, influenced church architecture throughout Southeast Asia. Spanish colonial urban planning also reflected important social and political principles. The requirement that indigenous peoples be allowed to maintain their own neighborhoods, the República de Indios within Spanish cities, created a form of urban multiculturalism that was unique among colonial systems. These indigenous neighborhoods maintained their own churches, schools, and government while participating in the broader urban economy. The integration of different racial and cultural groups within Spanish colonial cities was facilitated by elaborate systems of social classification that recognized the complex realities of colonial society. The Sistema de Castas, while certainly hierarchical, allowed for social mobility and cultural mixing in ways that created vibrant and diverse urban communities. Spanish colonial cities also served as centers of education and culture that extended far beyond their immediate regions. The universities, libraries, printing presses, and schools established in major colonial cities created intellectual networks that connected the Americas with Europe and Asia, while fostering the development of distinctive colonial forms of learning and artistic expression. The economic foundation of these urban achievements was provided by the wealth flowing from American mines and global trade, but their deeper significance lay in their demonstration that European civilization could be successfully transplanted to other continents while incorporating local influences and adapting to local conditions. The hospitals, orphanages, and charitable institutions established in Spanish colonial cities represented an early form of comprehensive social services that provided care for the sick, poor, and disabled regardless of their racial or cultural background. These institutions, typically funded by a combination of royal revenues, private donations, and church resources, created urban environments that were more socially inclusive than most European cities of the same period. The public spaces of Spanish colonial cities' plazas, markets, processional routes were designed to facilitate social interaction and cultural exchange among diverse populations. The elaborate religious processions and civic festivals that marked the colonial calendar brought together people of all social levels and cultural backgrounds in shared celebrations that reinforced community identity while respecting cultural diversity. As night falls over these cities of splendor, their illuminated churches and palaces standing as monuments to human achievement and cultural synthesis, we can see how Spanish imperial civilization created urban environments that were not merely functional but beautiful, not merely Spanish but cosmopolitan, not merely colonial but creative. These cities represented the physical embodiment of Spanish imperial ideals and continue to influence urban development and architectural practice throughout the world today. As we conclude this second part of our journey through the Spanish Empire, we have witnessed the extraordinary achievements of imperial administration, economic innovation, and cultural flowering that marked the height of Spanish global dominance. We have seen how the Council of the Indies and Casa de Contratación created governmental institutions capable of coordinating policy across 3 oceans, how the silver of Potosi and Zacatecas financed the world's first global economy, and how the genius of Cervantes, Velázquez, and their contemporaries created cultural achievements that continue to inspire and influence the world today. We have observed how Spanish colonial cities, from the magnificence of Mexico City to the strategic importance of Manila, represented a new form of urban civilization that successfully integrated diverse populations while maintaining high standards of beauty, functionality, and cultural sophistication. These achievements were made possible by the wealth flowing from American mines and global trade routes, but their deeper significance lay in their demonstration that human creativity and achievement could flourish across cultural boundaries and vast distances. Chapter 13. The Networks of Knowledge Universities and Learning Across the Empire. In the quiet halls of the University of Mexico, established in 1551, indigenous students debate theological questions in Latin with their Spanish and Mestizo classmates, while in the library of the University of Lima, scholars compile the first comprehensive dictionaries of Quechua and other Andean languages. Across the ocean in Salamanca, professors develop new theories of international law based on reports from colonial administrators about the governance of diverse populations. This exchange of knowledge across continents and cultures represents one of the most remarkable achievements of the Spanish Empire, the creation of the world's first global intellectual community. The establishment of universities in Spanish America, just 30 years after the conquest of Mexico, represented a revolutionary commitment to education and intellectual development that had no parallel in other colonial systems. While other European powers focused primarily on extracting wealth from their colonies, Spain invested heavily in creating institutions of higher learning that would serve not only Spanish colonists, but also indigenous and mixed-race populations. The University of Mexico, modeled closely on the University of Salamanca, offered instruction in theology, canon and civil law, medicine, rhetoric, grammar, and the arts. But unlike its European model, the colonial university had to grapple with questions that had no precedent in European academic tradition. How should Christian theology incorporate indigenous concepts of the divine? How should European legal principles be applied to societies with completely different traditions of law and governance? How should European medicine be adapted to treat diseases unknown in Europe, and to incorporate indigenous healing practices that often proved more effective than European remedies? These questions required Spanish colonial scholars to become pioneers in what we would now call comparative religion, anthropology, and ethnobotany. The Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagun spent decades at the Colegio de Santa Cruz in Mexico, learning Nahuatl and systematically recording indigenous history, religion, and natural knowledge. His monumental general history of the things of New Spain represents one of the earliest examples of systematic ethnographic research, and preserved invaluable knowledge about pre-Columbian civilization that would otherwise have been lost. Similar work was being conducted throughout Spanish America. In Peru, the Jesuit chronicler Bernabé Cobo compiled comprehensive accounts of Inca history and Andean natural history, while indigenous and mestizo scholars like Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala created remarkable works that presented indigenous perspectives on the conquest and colonial experience. These works, written in a mixture of Spanish, Quechua, and pictographic elements, represented entirely new forms of historical and literary expression. The linguistic achievements of Spanish colonial scholars were particularly impressive. Spanish missionaries and administrators recognized that effective governance and evangelization required mastery of indigenous languages, leading to the creation of sophisticated dictionaries, grammars, and linguistic studies that preserved knowledge of dozens of American languages. The Art de la Lengua Mexicana by Antonio del Rincón, published in 1595, was among the first systematic grammars of an indigenous American language and established methodological principles that influenced linguistic research for centuries. These linguistic studies were not merely academic exercises, but practical tools for administration and cultural exchange. The requirement that Christian doctrine be taught in indigenous languages led to the translation of religious texts into Nahuatl, Quechua, Maya, and dozens of other languages. These translations required Spanish scholars to develop new theological vocabularies and to grapple seriously with the question of how universal Christian truths could be expressed in culturally specific terms. The medical schools established in Spanish colonial universities faced similar challenges of cultural adaptation and innovation. European physicians working in America encountered diseases unknown in Europe, including syphilis, which may have originated in America, while also discovering that indigenous medical practices were often more effective than European treatments for local conditions. The Real Y Pontificia Universidad de Mexico established the first chair of medicine in the Americas in 1578, and colonial physicians began systematically studying indigenous pharmacology and medical practices. The result was a distinctive form of colonial medicine that combined European theoretical knowledge with indigenous practical expertise and American medicinal plants. Francisco Hernandez, physician to Philip Roman II, spent 7 years in Mexico systematically cataloging indigenous plants and their medical uses. His monumental work, which described over 3,000 plant species and their therapeutic properties, represented the most comprehensive pharmacological study of its time and contributed significantly to European medical knowledge. The legal scholarship produced in Spanish colonial universities was equally innovative. Spanish colonial lawyers had to develop new legal principles to govern societies that included multiple legal traditions: Spanish civil and canon law, indigenous customary law, and royal legislation specific to colonial conditions. The result was a sophisticated body of colonial jurisprudence that influenced legal development throughout the Americas. The University of Lima became particularly renowned for its legal scholarship, producing lawyers and judges who served throughout the Spanish Empire and contributed to the development of Spanish colonial law. The university's graduates often returned to Spain to serve in the Council of the Indies, bringing colonial experience to bear on imperial policymaking. Perhaps most remarkably, Spanish colonial universities were genuinely multicultural institutions that welcomed students regardless of their racial or cultural background. Indigenous students, particularly those from noble families, were actively recruited and provided with scholarships. The Colegio de Santa Cruz in Mexico was specifically established to provide higher education for indigenous students, offering instruction in Latin, theology, and philosophy alongside traditional indigenous knowledge. These indigenous scholars often became cultural brokers who facilitated communication between Spanish and indigenous societies. They served as translators, administrators, and legal advocates, playing crucial roles in the complex negotiations required to govern diverse colonial populations. Their bilingual and bicultural education enabled them to serve as bridges between different worldviews and legal systems. The printing presses established in colonial universities and religious institutions represented another crucial element in the development of imperial intellectual networks. The first printing press in the Americas was established in Mexico City in 1539, and by the end of the 16th century, presses were operating in major cities throughout Spanish America. These presses produced not only religious and administrative texts, but also works of literature, history, and natural philosophy in both Spanish and indigenous languages. The publication of books in Nahuatl, Quechua, and other indigenous languages helped preserve these linguistic traditions while also facilitating their evolution and development. The intellectual networks created by Spanish colonial universities extended far beyond the Americas. Colonial scholars maintained regular correspondence with their counterparts in Europe, sending reports on their discoveries and receiving the latest European publications. The annual treasure fleets carried not only silver and gold, but also books, manuscripts, and scholarly correspondence that connected colonial intellectuals with global currents of thought. Spanish colonial scholars also contributed significantly to European intellectual development. Their reports on indigenous American societies influenced European thinking about human nature, political organization, and cultural diversity. The discovery of sophisticated indigenous civilizations challenged European assumptions about cultural superiority and contributed to the development of more nuanced understandings of human society and cultural difference. The Jesuit missions in Paraguay developed particularly innovative approaches to education that combined European and indigenous elements in unique ways. The mission schools taught European subjects like Latin, music, and theology, alongside indigenous crafts, agriculture, and artistic traditions. The result was a distinctive form of education that prepared students to function effectively in both European and indigenous cultural contexts. The scientific achievements of Spanish colonial scholars were equally impressive. Colonial universities established chairs in mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, and colonial scholars made important contributions to these fields. The high altitude and clear skies of cities like Quito and Cusco provided excellent conditions for astronomical observation, and colonial astronomers produced some of the most accurate celestial observations of their time. The geographic knowledge accumulated by Spanish colonial scholars was particularly valuable. Colonial universities trained the surveyors, cartographers, and navigators who mapped the territories of the Spanish Empire and maintained the detailed geographic knowledge required for effective administration and commerce. The botanical gardens established in connection with colonial universities served both research and practical purposes. These gardens, which cultivated both European and indigenous plants, facilitated the exchange of agricultural knowledge and contributed to the development of new crops and agricultural techniques that benefited populations throughout the empire. The philosophical and theological scholarship produced in Spanish colonial universities grappled with fundamental questions about human nature, cultural difference, and the moral obligations of imperial rule. Colonial scholars developed sophisticated theories about natural law, cultural relativism, and the rights of indigenous peoples that influenced intellectual development throughout Europe. As we observe the quiet dedication of scholars working in libraries and lecture halls across 3 continents, copying manuscripts, conducting experiments, and debating fundamental questions about the nature of human society, we see how the Spanish Empire fostered intellectual achievement and cultural exchange on a scale never before attempted. These universities and scholars created the intellectual foundations for colonial society, while also contributing to global knowledge and understanding. Their work reminds us that the Spanish Empire was not merely a system of political and economic control, but a comprehensive civilization that encouraged learning, creativity, and cultural synthesis. The knowledge they produced and preserved continues to influence scholarship and intellectual development throughout the world today. Chapter 14. Sacred Art and Soaring spires the cultural synthesis of colonial architecture. In the high valleys of the Andes, where the air is thin and the light has a crystalline clarity found nowhere else on Earth. Indigenous craftsmen are carefully applying gold leaf to the interior of a Baroque church. Their techniques passed down through generations, now serving to glorify the Christian God. In Mexico, master carvers who learned their art decorating Aztec temples now create elaborate altar pieces that soar toward heaven in explosions of carved saints, angels, and native flora. This fusion of traditions, this marriage of European and indigenous artistic genius, created one of the most distinctive and magnificent art forms in human history. The churches of colonial Spanish America represent far more than mere architectural achievements. They embody the cultural synthesis that made Spanish imperial civilization unique among colonial systems. Unlike other colonial powers that sought to impose European culture, unchanged upon colonial subjects, Spain created space for artistic fusion that produced entirely new forms of beauty and expression. The Great Cathedral of Mexico City, rising from the central plaza where Aztec temples once stood, tells the story of this cultural synthesis in stone and gold. Its massive scale, larger than most European cathedrals, was made possible by American wealth, while its decorative program incorporated motifs and techniques that had no European precedents. Indigenous craftsmen, trained in the sophisticated artistic traditions of pre-Columbian Mexico, brought their ancestral skills to the service of Christian art. The result was a distinctive style that maintained European architectural principles while incorporating indigenous aesthetics, techniques, and symbolism. Angels in Mexican colonial churches often display indigenous facial features, while decorative patterns draw from pre-Columbian textile and ceramic traditions. The famous Churrigueresque style that dominated late colonial Mexican architecture represents the full flowering of this cultural synthesis. Named after the Spanish architect José Benito de Churriguera, this Baroque style reached its highest development in Mexico, where indigenous craftsmen transformed European decorative principles into something entirely new. The Sagrario Metropolitano, adjacent to Mexico City's cathedral, exemplifies this achievement. Its facade, completed in 1768, presents a riot of carved decoration that seems to defy the laws of gravity and stone. Every surface is covered with elaborate ornamentation, saints and angels, flowers and fruits, geometric patterns and symbolic representations, all carved with a precision and exuberance that rivals the greatest achievements of Baroque art anywhere in the world. But perhaps even more remarkable than the facades are the interiors of these churches, where European and indigenous artistic traditions achieved their most complete synthesis. The Church of Santa Maria Tenochtitlan in Puebla presents an interior so rich and complex that visitors must spend hours to appreciate its full magnificence. Here, indigenous craftsmen working under Spanish direction created a vision of heaven that incorporated both Christian and pre-Columbian elements. Angels appear with indigenous features and clothing, while decorative patterns draw from both European Baroque and indigenous geometric traditions. The overall effect is overwhelming, a space so rich in decoration and symbolism that it seems to transport visitors to another realm entirely. The technical achievements of these indigenous craftsmen were extraordinary. Working without the mechanical aids available to European builders, they developed innovative techniques for carving stone, working with stucco, and applying gold leaf that often surpassed European standards. Their understanding of local materials, different types of stone, native woods, local minerals for pigments allowed them to create works that were perfectly adapted to American conditions while maintaining the highest artistic standards. In Peru, the cultural synthesis took different but equally remarkable forms. The churches of Cusco, built on the foundations of Inca temples and incorporating massive stone blocks from earlier structures, created a unique architectural language that acknowledged both the destruction and the continuity of Andean civilization. The Church of La Compañía in Cusco, built by the Jesuits in the 17th century, presents a facade that is recognizably Baroque in its overall organization, but distinctly Andean in its details. Indigenous craftsmen carved decorative elements that drew from both European and pre-Columbian traditions, creating a style that was neither purely Spanish nor purely indigenous, but something entirely new. The interior decoration of Peruvian colonial churches often incorporated indigenous textile patterns translated into stone and stucco. The elaborate geometric designs that had adorned Inca textiles and ceramics now served to glorify Christian saints and biblical scenes, creating a visual language that connected past and present, indigenous and European traditions. The famous Cusco School of Painting represented another dimension of this cultural synthesis. Indigenous and mestizo artists, trained in European techniques by Spanish masters, developed a distinctive style that combined European compositional principles with indigenous aesthetics and symbolism. These paintings, which decorated churches throughout the Andes, often depicted Christian subjects with indigenous features and clothing. The Virgin Mary might appear wearing traditional Andean garments, while saints were given the facial features and skin tones of indigenous Americans. The landscape backgrounds often depicted recognizably Andean scenery, with llamas and vicuñas replacing the sheep and cattle of European religious art. The technical quality of these paintings was extraordinarily high. Indigenous artists mastered the complex techniques of oil painting and achieved levels of skill that rivaled the best European work. But they also incorporated traditional indigenous pigments and techniques that gave their work distinctive qualities not found in European painting. The music that filled these churches represented yet another dimension of cultural synthesis. Indigenous musicians, trained by Spanish and Italian masters, learned to play European instruments while also adapting traditional indigenous instruments to serve Christian worship. The result was a distinctive form of colonial music that combined European polyphonic traditions with indigenous musical elements. Indigenous musicians composed masses and motets that maintained European harmonic principles, while incorporating melodic and rhythmic elements from traditional music. In the remote missions of Paraguay, Jesuit musicians working with indigenous communities developed particularly innovative approaches to musical synthesis. The Guarani people proved remarkably gifted musicians, and under Jesuit direction, they created musical works that combined European and indigenous traditions in sophisticated ways. The churches of the Philippines represented the easternmost extension of this cultural synthesis. Spanish friars working with Chinese and Filipino craftsmen created a distinctive architectural style that incorporated Asian influences alongside European and indigenous elements. The Baroque churches of the Philippines, with their elaborate wooden decorations and earthquake-resistant construction, influenced church architecture throughout Southeast Asia. The use of local hardwoods, traditional joinery techniques, and Asian decorative motifs created buildings that were recognizably Catholic while remaining distinctly Asian. The silverwork produced in colonial workshops throughout Spanish America represented another remarkable achievement of cultural synthesis. Indigenous craftsmen, many of whom had worked with precious metals for centuries before the Spanish arrival, brought their traditional skills to the service of Christian art. The elaborate silver altarpieces, chalices, and decorative objects produced in colonial workshops combined European forms with indigenous techniques and aesthetics. The use of traditional indigenous symbols alongside Christian iconography created works that spoke to both Spanish and indigenous audiences, while maintaining the highest standards of craftsmanship. The sculptural programs of colonial churches were equally impressive. Indigenous craftsmen carved elaborate retablos altarpieces that often extended from floor to ceiling and incorporated dozens of individual figures and decorative elements. These works required years to complete and demanded the highest levels of skill and artistic vision. The saints and biblical figures depicted in these retablos often displayed indigenous features and wore clothing that reflected local traditions. This indigenization of Christian art helped make Christianity more accessible to indigenous audiences, while also creating new forms of religious expression that enriched Catholic artistic tradition. The urban planning of colonial cities was designed to showcase these architectural achievements while creating public spaces that facilitated social interaction and cultural exchange. The central plazas, surrounded by cathedral, government buildings, and aristocratic residences, provided settings for the elaborate religious processions and civic festivals that marked the colonial calendar. These processions, combining European Catholic traditions with indigenous ceremonial elements, created spectacular displays that engaged all the senses. Elaborate floats carrying religious images processed through streets decorated with flowers and colored sand, while musicians performed compositions that blended European and indigenous traditions. The overall effect was to create urban environments that were not merely functional but beautiful, spaces that elevated the human spirit while serving practical purposes. The integration of architecture, sculpture, painting, and music created total artistic environments that few civilizations have matched in their sophistication and emotional impact. As evening light streams through the stained glass windows of these magnificent churches, illuminating altar pieces that represent the collaborative genius of Spanish and indigenous artists, we witness one of humanity's greatest achievements in cultural synthesis. These buildings stand as monuments to the possibility of creating beauty from diversity, of honoring different traditions while creating something new and magnificent. As we reach the conclusion of our second journey through the Spanish Empire, we have witnessed the extraordinary administrative, economic, and cultural achievements that marked the height of Spanish global dominance. From the sophisticated governmental institutions that coordinated policy across 3 oceans to the silver streams that financed the world's first global economy, from the literary genius of Cervantes to the architectural magnificence of colonial churches, we have seen how Spanish imperial civilization achieved levels of sophistication and cultural synthesis that continue to inspire and influence the world today. We have observed how Spanish colonial cities represented a new form of urban civilization that successfully integrated diverse populations while maintaining the highest standards of beauty and functionality. We have seen how universities and scholars created the world's first global intellectual community, fostering learning and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. And we have witnessed how indigenous and European artists, working together, created architectural and artistic achievements that stand among humanity's greatest cultural accomplishments. These achievements were made possible by the wealth flowing from American mines and global trade routes, but their deeper significance lies in their demonstration that different cultures could work together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. The Spanish Empire at its height represented not merely a system of political and economic control, but a comprehensive civilization that encouraged human creativity and achievement across cultural boundaries. Yet even as we admire these remarkable accomplishments, we must remember that this golden age was not destined to last forever. In our final part, we will explore how the Spanish Empire adapted to new challenges and changing circumstances, how it evolved and eventually transformed into the independent nations of Latin America, and how its legacy continues to influence the modern world. But for now, as the sun sets over the magnificent cities and churches of the Spanish Empire at its zenith, we can rest in appreciation of one of history's greatest achievements in human civilization, an empire that truly spanned the globe and created lasting contributions to human knowledge, artistry, and understanding. The Spanish Empire: Challenges, Independence, and Enduring Legacy. Chapter 15. The Weight of Empire Challenges and Transformations, 17th–18th Centuries. As the 17th century dawned over the Spanish Empire, the Silver Fleet still sailed from Acapulco and Portobelo. The universities of Mexico City and Lima continued to produce scholars and administrators, and the churches of colonial America still echoed with the music of indigenous and European voices raised in harmony. Yet beneath this apparent continuity, profound changes were reshaping the empire that had once seemed destined to rule the world forever. The challenges facing Spain were not the result of any single catastrophic event, but rather the accumulation of pressures that tested the limits of even the world's most sophisticated imperial system. The very success of the Spanish Empire had created commitments and responsibilities that would prove increasingly difficult to sustain as global conditions changed and new competitors emerged. The most immediate challenge came from the empire's own European territories, where the complex inheritance of Charles V had burdened Spain with obligations across the continent. The Dutch Revolt, which began in 1566, would drag on for 80 years and drain enormous resources from the Spanish treasury. What had begun as a religious conflict, Catholic Spain, attempting to maintain control over increasingly Protestant territories, evolved into a broader struggle for independence that would ultimately cost Spain some of its richest European possessions. The Dutch proved to be formidable adversaries, combining religious fervor with commercial acumen and innovative military techniques. Their successful defense of small cities like Leyden and Alkmaar against overwhelming Spanish forces demonstrated that determination and superior logistics could overcome apparent military superiority. More importantly, Dutch success inspired other opponents of Spanish power and showed that the Spanish Empire, despite its vast resources, was not invincible. The economic foundations of Spanish power were simultaneously under strain from multiple directions. The flow of American silver, which had financed Spanish global dominance for over a century, was beginning to decline. The richest surface deposits at Potosi and other major mines had been exhausted, forcing miners to work deeper shafts at greater expense and danger. Production costs rose while output fell, reducing the profit margins that had made American mining so profitable. At the same time, the constant influx of American silver had created severe inflation throughout the Spanish Empire and much of Europe. This price revolution had initially benefited Spain by making Spanish goods more competitive in international markets. But as prices continued to rise, Spanish products became increasingly expensive compared to those produced in other countries. The Spanish crown found itself caught in a vicious cycle. Declining revenues forced it to borrow money at high interest rates, while the need to service these debts required ever more revenue. By the early 17th century, the Spanish monarchy had declared bankruptcy several times, and much of the silver arriving from America was immediately seized by creditors rather than being available for imperial administration. The human costs of continuous warfare were equally severe. The expulsion of the Morisco's Spanish Muslims who had converted to Christianity in 1609 represented both a demographic catastrophe and a massive loss of skilled labor and commercial expertise. An estimated 300,000 people were forced to leave Spain, many of whom had been successful farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, whose departure left entire regions economically devastated. This expulsion reflected the increasingly narrow religious orthodoxy that characterized 17th-century Spain. The same Catholic zeal that had motivated the conquest and evangelization of the Americas now turned inward, creating a society that was suspicious of diversity and innovation. The Spanish Inquisition, which had initially focused on ensuring the sincerity of religious conversions, increasingly became a force for intellectual conformity that discouraged the kind of creative thinking that had characterized the Spanish Golden Age. The contrast with emerging rival powers was stark. While Spain struggled with religious orthodoxy and economic stagnation, countries like England and France were developing more flexible political and economic systems that proved better adapted to changing global conditions. The English, in particular, were developing new forms of joint stock companies and banking institutions that allowed them to mobilize capital more efficiently than traditional Spanish methods. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, marked a crucial turning point in European power relations. Spain was forced to recognize the independence of the Dutch Republic, formally acknowledging the loss of some of its richest European territories. The treaty also established new principles of international law that limited the ability of any single power to dominate Europe, principles that worked against Spanish interests. The Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659, which ended the Franco-Spanish War, required Spain to cede significant territories to France and marked the beginning of French ascendancy in European affairs. For the first time since the early 16th century, Spain was clearly no longer the dominant European power, and its global empire began to seem more vulnerable to challenge from rival colonial powers. The death of Charles Roman II in 1700, without an heir, precipitated the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would reshape the Spanish Empire and European power relations. The war, which lasted from 1701 to 1714, was fought not only over who would rule Spain, but over whether the Spanish Empire would be partitioned among the European powers or remain intact under new management. The eventual victory of Philip V, the Bourbon grandson of Louis Roman XIV of France, brought a new dynasty to the Spanish throne, but also introduced new ideas about imperial administration. The Bourbons, influenced by French administrative practices and Enlightenment thinking, initiated a series of reforms designed to modernize and rationalize Spanish imperial government. The Bourbon reforms of the 18th century represented the most significant changes in Spanish colonial administration since the original establishment of the viceroyalty system. The creation of new viceroyalties, New Granada in 1717 and Rio de la Plata in 1776, reflected both the growth of colonial populations and the need for more efficient administration of distant territories. The intendant system, borrowed from French administrative practice, replaced many traditional colonial offices with professional administrators trained in modern techniques of governance and revenue collection. These intendants were charged with improving economic productivity, rationalizing tax collection, and strengthening imperial defense against increasingly aggressive rival powers. The establishment of free trade within the Spanish Empire, actually a carefully regulated system that allowed more Spanish ports to participate in American commerce, represented an attempt to stimulate colonial economic growth while maintaining imperial control. This system, implemented gradually throughout the 18th century, did succeed in increasing trade volumes and colonial revenues, but it also created new opportunities for foreign merchants to penetrate Spanish markets. Perhaps most significantly, The Bourbon reforms reflected a new understanding of the relationship between imperial centers and colonial peripheries. Rather than viewing the Americas primarily as sources of precious metals, 18th-century Spanish administrators increasingly recognized the colonies as markets for Spanish goods and sources of tropical products that could be exported to global markets. This shift in perspective led to increased investment in colonial infrastructure and economic development. New roads, bridges, and port facilities improved transportation and communication throughout Spanish America, while new agricultural techniques and crops were introduced to increase productivity and diversify colonial economies. The establishment of scientific expeditions and botanical gardens represented another dimension of 18th-century Spanish colonial policy. These enterprises, influenced by Enlightenment ideals about the importance of scientific knowledge, aimed to catalog and develop the natural resources of Spanish America more systematically than had previously been attempted. The famous Malaspina expedition, which circumnavigated the globe between 1789 and 1794, represented the culmination of these scientific efforts. Led by Alessandro Malaspina, an Italian navigator in Spanish service, the expedition collected vast amounts of scientific data about Spanish territories and produced detailed maps, botanical collections, and ethnographic studies that advanced scientific knowledge throughout Europe. Yet even as the Bourbon reforms modernized Spanish imperial administration, they also created new tensions within colonial society. The replacement of traditional colonial offices with professional administrators often displaced Creole elites who had expected to inherit positions of authority. The increased efficiency of tax collection, while improving imperial revenues, also increased the burden on colonial populations who had previously been able to avoid some fiscal obligations. More fundamentally, the Bourbon reforms reflected European Enlightenment thinking that increasingly viewed cultural diversity as an obstacle to efficient administration rather than as a source of strength. Unlike the Habsburg system, which had generally accommodated indigenous customs and legal systems, Bourbon administrators often sought to impose greater uniformity and European norms throughout the empire. This shift in administrative philosophy coincided with growing challenges from rival colonial powers. The British, Dutch, and French had all established their own American colonies and were increasingly willing to challenge Spanish dominance in the Caribbean and Pacific. The capture of Havana by the British in 1762, though temporary, demonstrated that even the most heavily fortified Spanish strongholds were vulnerable to attack. The American Revolution of 1776, while not directly threatening Spanish territories, established a precedent for successful colonial rebellion against European rule. Spanish support for the American revolutionaries, motivated primarily by anti-British sentiment, inadvertently provided colonial populations throughout the Americas with an example of how European rule could be successfully challenged. As the 18th century drew to a close, the Spanish Empire remained the world's most extensive political system, stretching from Spain to the Philippines and encompassing territories on every inhabited continent. Spanish America was more prosperous and populated than ever before, while Spanish influence in global commerce and culture remained significant. Yet the foundations of Spanish imperial dominance had been fundamentally altered. The empire now faced serious competitors in Europe and America, while internal tensions between different colonial populations and between colonial and metropolitan interests were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The stage was being set for the crisis that would ultimately transform the Spanish Empire and reshape the political map of the Americas. Chapter 16. The breaking point Napoleonic crisis and the seeds of independence. The morning of May 2nd, 1808, dawned like any other in Madrid, but by evening the Spanish Empire would be thrown into the greatest crisis of its three-century existence. French troops, supposedly allies in Spain's war against Portugal, had occupied key positions throughout the capital. When the people of Madrid rose in spontaneous revolt against the French occupation, they set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the independence of most of Spanish America and the transformation of the global political order. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain represented a crisis unprecedented in the Spanish imperial experience. For the first time since the union of Castile and Aragon, the Spanish throne was occupied by a foreign power. Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, might wear the crown, but his authority was rejected by most Spaniards, who viewed him as an illegitimate usurper imposed by foreign military force. The collapse of royal authority in Spain created an immediate constitutional crisis throughout the Spanish Empire. Colonial authorities, indigenous communities, and Spanish colonists had sworn allegiance to the Spanish crown, not to the French Empire. But with Ferdinand Roman VII held captive in France, and Joseph Bonaparte's authority rejected by most Spaniards, the legal foundations of imperial government suddenly seemed uncertain. In response to this crisis, juntas local governing councils emerged throughout Spain and Spanish America to maintain royal authority in the absence of the legitimate monarch. These juntas initially claimed to rule in Ferdinand Roman VII's name, maintaining the fiction of royal authority while exercising practical independence from any central government. The establishment of juntas represented a remarkable demonstration of the Spanish Empire's institutional sophistication and political maturity. Rather than collapsing into chaos when royal authority disappeared, Spanish territories throughout 3 continents organized themselves to maintain order and continuity of government. The legal and administrative systems developed over 3 centuries of imperial rule proved robust enough to function even without central direction. In Spanish America, the formation of juntas initially followed peninsular precedents. The Cabildo of Buenos Aires, following news of the French occupation of Spain, assumed governing authority over the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata in the name of Ferdinand Roman VII. Similar juntas were established in Caracas, Bogotá, Quito, and other major colonial cities, each claiming to represent royal authority while exercising practical independence. These early juntas were genuinely conservative institutions, seeking to preserve Spanish imperial unity while rejecting French authority. Their membership typically included Spanish colonial officials, Creole elites, and representatives of indigenous communities, a coalition united by loyalty to traditional Spanish institutions and opposition to foreign rule. Yet the very act of establishing local government independent of peninsular control represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between Spain and its American territories. For the first time in 3 centuries, Spanish Americans were governing themselves, making their own decisions about taxation, trade, and administration without reference to authorities in Madrid. The experience of self-government proved both exhilarating and educational. Colonial populations that had been excluded from major political decisions for centuries suddenly found themselves debating fundamental questions about representation, taxation, and the rights of different groups within colonial society. These debates, conducted in newspapers, pamphlets, and public meetings, created new forms of political consciousness and civic engagement. The war against Napoleon in Spain also demonstrated that European military superiority was not absolute. Spanish guerrilla warfare, supported by British arms and money, proved effective against the most powerful military force in Europe. This example was not lost on Spanish Americans, who began to consider whether similar techniques might be effective against Spanish rule if circumstances warranted. The Courts of Cadiz, the Spanish parliament that governed unoccupied Spain during the Napoleonic period, attempted to maintain imperial unity by offering American territories representation in the Spanish parliament. The Constitution of 1812, adopted by the courts, proclaimed the equality of Spanish Americans and peninsular Spaniards, and offered significant autonomy to colonial territories. But these concessions came too late to prevent the development of independence movements throughout Spanish America. The experience of self-government had awakened political ambitions that could not be satisfied by mere representation in a distant parliament. Moreover, the liberalization of trade during the Napoleonic period had created new commercial relationships that made formal independence economically attractive. The leaders of Spanish-American independence movements were not, for the most part, radical revolutionaries seeking to overthrow existing social systems. Instead, they were typically members of the colonial elite who had been educated in Spanish institutions, and who initially sought greater autonomy within the Spanish imperial system, rather than complete independence. Simón Bolívar, born into a wealthy Venezuelan Creole family, received a European education and initially served in the colonial militia. His political awakening came not from exposure to revolutionary ideas, but from frustration with Spanish policies that limited Creole political participation and economic opportunities. When he declared Venezuelan independence in 1811, he framed it as a defense of traditional Spanish liberties against French tyranny. José de San Martin, born in Argentina but educated in Spanish military academies, served with distinction in Spanish armies fighting against Napoleon. His decision to support Argentine independence came only after it became clear that the restored Spanish monarchy would not grant the autonomy that American Creoles believed they deserved. In Mexico, the independence movement began with Miguel Hidalgo, a parish priest who called for rebellion not against Spain, but against Spanish policies that oppressed indigenous and mestizo populations. Hidalgo's famous Grito de Dolores on September 16, 1810, called for independence from Spanish rule, but also for the abolition of slavery and the restoration of indigenous land rights. The social dimension of Mexican independence was further developed by José María Morelos, another priest who continued Hidalgo's movement after the latter's execution. Morelos articulated a vision of Mexican independence that would create a society based on racial equality and social justice ideas that went far beyond simple political autonomy. The independence movements were not uniformly successful or supported throughout Spanish America. In Peru, which had been the wealthiest and most loyalist of the Spanish viceroyalties, independence came only through external military intervention by San Martin and Bolívar. Many Peruvians, particularly indigenous communities, were uncertain whether independence would improve their conditions or simply replace Spanish rule with Creole domination. The wars of independence were brutal and destructive, lasting in some regions for over a decade and causing enormous loss of life and property. The social fabric of colonial society was torn apart as different groups, peninsular Spaniards, Creoles, mestizos, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans found themselves on different sides of the conflict. Yet the independence movements also created opportunities for previously excluded groups to participate in political life. The military necessities of the independence wars led to the recruitment of soldiers from all racial and social backgrounds, while the ideological rhetoric of liberty and equality created space for demands for broader social change. Women played crucial roles in the independence movements, often as suppliers of information, money, and supplies to revolutionary forces. Some, like Manuela Sainz in Gran Colombia and Leona Vicario in Mexico, became active participants in military and political activities, challenging traditional gender roles and expectations. The indigenous peoples of Spanish America found themselves in particularly complex situations during the independence period. Some communities supported independence, seeing it as an opportunity to regain greater autonomy and recognition of traditional rights. Others remained loyal to Spain, fearing that Creole rule would be more oppressive than colonial administration had been. The outcome of the independence movements varied significantly across different regions. In Mexico, independence ultimately came through a conservative coalition that sought to preserve traditional social hierarchies while establishing political autonomy. In Gran Colombia, Bolivar's vision of a unified, racially integrated republic proved impossible to maintain, leading to the fragmentation of his intended confederation. By 1826, almost all of mainland Spanish America had achieved independence, with only Cuba and Puerto Rico remaining under Spanish rule. Brazil, while following a different path under Portuguese rule, had also achieved independence, completing the liberation of most of South America from European colonial control. The achievement of independence represented one of the most remarkable political transformations in modern history. Within less than 2 decades, European colonial rule over most of the Americas had been overthrown, creating more than a dozen new republics and fundamentally altering the global balance of power. Yet independence was only the beginning of the challenges facing the former Spanish colonies. The new republics inherited the social tensions, economic problems, and regional divisions that had characterized colonial society, while losing the administrative expertise and international connections that had made the Spanish imperial system function effectively. The transition from colony to independent nation proved far more difficult than the achievement of independence itself. Many of the new republics experienced decades of political instability, civil war, and economic difficulties, as they struggled to create effective national governments and integrate diverse populations into coherent national communities. Chapter 17: The Phoenix of Nations, the Enduring Legacy of Spanish Empire. As the dust settled on the battlefields of Ayacucho and the last Spanish forces departed from the mainland of South America in 1824, observers might have concluded that the Spanish Empire had simply ceased to exist, swept away by the tide of Republican revolution that had transformed the Americas. Yet such a conclusion would have missed the profound truth that empires, like mighty rivers, do not simply disappear when they reach the sea. They transform, spreading their waters into countless streams that continue to nourish distant shores. Today, more than 500 million people across the world speak Spanish as their native language, making it one of the most widely spoken languages on Earth. From the bustling streets of Mexico City to the tango halls of Buenos Aires, from the coffee plantations of Colombia to the vineyards of Chile, from the Philippines to Equatorial Guinea, the Spanish language serves as a living bridge connecting diverse peoples and cultures across continents and oceans. This linguistic legacy represents far more than mere communication. It embodies a shared cultural heritage that continues to evolve and flourish centuries after the end of formal colonial rule. Spanish is not simply the language of conquest imposed upon subject peoples, but rather a living synthesis that has incorporated thousands of words from Nahuatl, Quechua, Tagalog, and dozens of other indigenous languages, creating regional varieties that reflect the unique histories and experiences of different communities. The Spanish of Mexico carries within it the rhythms and vocabulary of ancient Mesoamerican civilizations, while the Spanish of Peru echoes with Quechua and Aymara, influences that connect modern speakers to the high Andes and the legacy of Inca civilization. In the Philippines, Spanish borrowed from Chinese, Malay, and Tagalog to create unique expressions that reflected the multicultural reality of Pacific trade and cultural exchange. But language is only the most visible element of a much broader cultural legacy that continues to shape the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. The religious festivals that fill the calendars of Latin American and Filipino communities represent remarkable syntheses of Catholic and indigenous traditions that were forged during the colonial period, but have continued to evolve and develop. The celebration of the Day of the Dead in Mexico transforms the Catholic observance of All Saints' Day into a uniquely Mexican festival that honors deceased ancestors in ways that draw from both European and pre-Columbian traditions. The elaborate processions of Holy Week in Guatemala and Peru combine Spanish Baroque religious theater with indigenous ceremonial practices to create spectacles of remarkable beauty and spiritual power. In the Philippines, the Sinulog Festival in Cebu blends Catholic devotion to the Santo Niño with traditional Filipino dancing and music, creating a celebration that is simultaneously deeply Catholic and distinctly Filipino. These festivals represent not the survival of ancient traditions unchanged, but rather the creative adaptation and synthesis that has characterized Spanish imperial culture from its earliest days. The culinary traditions of the former Spanish Empire tell similar stories of creative synthesis and adaptation. Mexican cuisine, recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, represents a sophisticated fusion of indigenous ingredients and techniques with Spanish and other global influences. The use of corn, beans, chilies, and chocolate, all indigenous to Mexico, combined with Spanish-introduced pork, beef, cheese, and wheat to create a cuisine that is neither purely indigenous nor purely European but something entirely new. Similarly, Peruvian cuisine has gained international recognition for its creative combination of indigenous ingredients like quinoa and potatoes, with Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, and African influences introduced during and after the colonial period. The result is a culinary tradition that reflects Peru's complex multicultural history, while creating flavors and combinations that exist nowhere else in the world. The architectural legacy of the Spanish Empire continues to shape the physical environment of cities and towns throughout Latin America and the Philippines. The central plaza, surrounded by cathedral, government buildings, and commercial establishments, remains the heart of countless communities, from small towns in rural Mexico to major cities like Lima, Bogotá, and Manila. These plazas continue to serve their original function as centers of community life, where people of all social backgrounds come together for markets, festivals, political gatherings, and daily social interaction. The democratic character of Spanish colonial urban planning, creating public spaces accessible to all members of the community, established principles of civic design that continue to influence urban development today. The Baroque churches of colonial Spanish America, with their elaborate facades and richly decorated interiors, remain not only active centers of worship, but also repositories of artistic achievement that attract visitors from throughout the world. The integration of indigenous and European artistic traditions that characterized colonial church decoration created a distinctive aesthetic that continues to influence contemporary artists and architects. The legal systems of Latin American countries continue to reflect their Spanish colonial origins in fundamental ways. The civil law tradition that predominates throughout the region traces its origins to Spanish colonial legal codes, while concepts of indigenous rights and community property that were first developed in colonial Spanish America continue to influence contemporary legal developments. The Spanish colonial recognition of indigenous communities as corporate entities with collective rights to land and self-government established legal precedents that continue to be important in contemporary discussions of indigenous rights and cultural autonomy. While the implementation of these rights was often inadequate during the colonial period, the legal principles established in Spanish colonial law provided foundations for later developments in indigenous rights throughout the Americas. The educational institutions established during the colonial period also left lasting legacies. The universities founded in Mexico City, Lima, and other colonial centers established traditions of higher education and scholarly inquiry that continue to this day. The emphasis on education in both Spanish and indigenous languages that characterized colonial missionary work established principles of multicultural education that continue to influence educational policy throughout Latin America. Perhaps most profoundly, the Spanish Empire established patterns of cultural mixing and racial synthesis that created new forms of human community unprecedented in world history. The mestizaje that characterized Spanish colonial society, the biological and cultural mixing of European, indigenous, and African populations, created societies that were genuinely multicultural rather than simply multi-ethnic. Unlike colonial systems that enforced rigid separation between different racial groups, Spanish colonial society, while certainly hierarchical, permitted and even encouraged cultural exchange and intermarriage that created new forms of identity and community. The elaborate systema de castas that classified different racial mixtures may seem antiquated today, but it also reflected a recognition that colonial society was genuinely diverse, and that this diversity required legal and social accommodation. The political legacy of the Spanish Empire is equally complex and enduring. The independence movements that ended formal colonial rule were led by men educated in Spanish institutions and inspired by Spanish legal and political traditions, as well as by Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality. The constitutions of the new Latin American republics drew heavily from Spanish legal traditions, while also incorporating new ideas about representative government and individual rights. The federal systems adopted by many Latin American countries reflected attempts to balance central authority with regional autonomy, a challenge that the Spanish Empire had faced for centuries in governing diverse territories across vast distances. The solutions developed were not always successful, but they represented serious attempts to create political systems that could accommodate diversity while maintaining unity. The Spanish Empire's role as a pioneer of globalization cannot be overstated. For over 3 centuries, the Spanish Empire maintained the world's first truly global economic system, connecting Europe, America, Asia, and Africa in networks of trade and cultural exchange that prefigured modern globalization. The silver mines of Potosi financed trade from Beijing to London, while the Manila galleons carried Asian goods to American markets and American products to European consumers. This early globalization created patterns of cultural exchange and economic interdependence that continue to influence the modern world. The crops introduced from America to Europe and Asia, potatoes, corn, tomatoes, chocolate, transformed global agriculture and cuisine, while Asian goods like silk, porcelain, and spices became integrated into American and European material culture. The contemporary Spanish-speaking world represents one of the most dynamic and rapidly growing cultural regions in the global community. Hispanic populations in the United States are projected to exceed 100 million by 2050, while Latin American economies continue to develop and modernize. The creative industries of the Spanish-speaking world, film, television, music, literature increasingly influence global popular culture. Spanish-language literature, from the magical realism of Gabriel Garcia Marquez to the contemporary works of authors like Roberto Bolaño and Elena Poniatowska, continues to win international recognition and influence world literature. Spanish-language cinema, from the films of Luis Buñuel to contemporary directors like Alejandro González Iñárritu and Pedro Almodóvar, has achieved global recognition for its artistic achievement and cultural insight. The telenovela, a distinctly Latin American television format, has become a global phenomenon, exported to markets throughout the world and adapted to local conditions in dozens of countries. This cultural influence represents a reversal of historical patterns. Instead of receiving European or North American cultural products, the Spanish-speaking world now exports its own cultural creations to global markets. Perhaps most significantly, the Spanish-speaking world today represents a laboratory for addressing some of the most pressing challenges facing the global community. Questions of indigenous rights, environmental protection, sustainable development, and cultural diversity that were first grappled with in Spanish colonial America continue to be addressed by contemporary Latin American societies with creativity and innovation. The environmental challenges facing the Amazon rainforest, the Andes Mountains, and other ecosystems within the former Spanish Empire require solutions that balance economic development with environmental protection and indigenous rights challenges that echo the complex negotiations between different groups and interests that characterized Spanish colonial society. The ongoing vitality of indigenous languages and cultures throughout Latin America represents both a challenge and an opportunity for contemporary societies. Countries like Bolivia and Ecuador have recognized indigenous languages as co-official with Spanish, while Peru has implemented policies to preserve and develop indigenous cultural traditions alongside modern economic development. These developments represent not a rejection of the Spanish colonial legacy, but rather a continuation of the cultural synthesis and adaptation that characterized Spanish imperial civilization at its best. The capacity to incorporate diverse traditions and populations while maintaining social cohesion remains one of the most valuable legacies of the Spanish Empire for addressing contemporary global challenges. Chapter 18. Reflections on Empire: Understanding the Spanish Legacy in Our Global Age. As we near the end of our journey through 3 centuries of Spanish imperial history, we find ourselves confronting questions that extend far beyond the specific details of viceroys and treasure fleets, of conquistadors and missionaries, of silver mines and Baroque churches. The Spanish Empire, in its rise and transformation, offers us a mirror in which to examine some of the most fundamental questions about human civilization. How do different cultures interact and influence each other? What are the possibilities and limitations of political systems that attempt to govern diverse populations across vast territories? How do we balance the legitimate pride in historical achievements with honest acknowledgement of historical injustices? The Spanish Empire was neither the paradise that some of its admirers have portrayed nor the hell that its detractors have claimed. Like all human institutions, it was a complex and often contradictory system that produced both remarkable achievements and significant failures, both inspiring examples of cultural synthesis and troubling instances of exploitation and oppression. What makes the Spanish Empire particularly worthy of study is not that it was perfect, but that it was genuinely unprecedented in its scope and complexity. Never before had any human society attempted to govern such diverse populations across such vast distances, or to create institutional systems that could accommodate such different cultural traditions and economic needs. The administrative innovations developed by Spanish imperial government, from the Council of the Indies to the system of viceroyalties, from the laws of the Indies to the recognition of indigenous corporate rights, represented serious attempts to address challenges that no previous civilization had faced. The solutions developed were not always successful, and they often reflected the limitations and prejudices of their time, but they also demonstrated a remarkable capacity for institutional learning and adaptation. The economic innovations of the Spanish Empire were equally significant. The creation of the world's first global currency system based on Spanish silver, the development of trans-Pacific trade routes connecting Asia and America, and the establishment of commercial networks that spanned 3 oceans represented achievements in economic organization that would not be matched again until the modern era. These economic innovations were not merely technical achievements, but also social and cultural ones. The integration of indigenous Americans, enslaved Africans, Asian migrants, and European colonists into complex economic systems required the development of new forms of social organization and cultural accommodation that had no historical precedents. The cultural achievements of the Spanish Empire, from the literature of the Golden Age to the Baroque churches of colonial America, from the universities of Spanish America to the scientific expeditions of the 18th century, represented not simply the transfer of European culture to other continents, but the creation of new forms of cultural expression that synthesized influences from multiple continents and civilizations. The Spanish colonial Baroque style, with its fusion of European architectural principles with indigenous decorative traditions, created buildings of extraordinary beauty that influenced architectural development worldwide. The literature produced in Spanish America, from the chronicles of indigenous historians like Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala to the poetry of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, created new forms of literary expression that enriched global literature. Yet we cannot ignore the dark aspects of Spanish colonial history, the devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous populations, the exploitation of indigenous and African labor, the destruction of indigenous cultural artifacts and historical records, and the various forms of discrimination and oppression that characterized colonial society. These failures and injustices were real and had lasting consequences that continue to influence contemporary society. The demographic catastrophe that befell indigenous populations in the century following European contact represents one of the greatest tragedies in human history. The systems of forced labor that characterized much of colonial mining and agriculture caused enormous suffering and disrupted traditional social systems throughout the Americas. At the same time, it is important to place these failures in historical context and to avoid the anachronistic application of contemporary moral standards to historical situations. The Spanish Empire operated in a world where slavery was universal, where religious tolerance was virtually unknown, where democratic government was unimaginable, and where systematic concern for indigenous rights was unprecedented. What is remarkable about the Spanish Empire is not that it perfectly embodied modern ideals of human rights and cultural sensitivity ideals that did not exist in the 16th century, but that it developed institutions and practices that were often more humane and inclusive than those of its contemporaries, and that established precedents for later developments in human rights and cultural protection. The Spanish colonial recognition of indigenous peoples as rational beings with souls and rights, embodied in the laws of Burgos of 1512 and subsequent legislation, was far ahead of its time and established legal principles that influenced later developments in international law and human rights. The Spanish colonial practice of educating indigenous and mestizo students alongside European colonists in the same institutions was unique among colonial systems and created opportunities for social mobility and cultural advancement that existed nowhere else in the colonial world. The Spanish Empire's approach to cultural and racial mixing, while certainly hierarchical and often discriminatory, was more inclusive and flexible than the rigid racial segregation that characterized other colonial systems. The recognition of mestizo and mulatto populations as legitimate members of colonial society, rather than marginal outcasts, created possibilities for social integration and cultural synthesis that influenced the development of modern multicultural societies. Perhaps most importantly, the Spanish Empire demonstrated that different cultures could work together to create achievements greater than the sum of their individual contributions. The Baroque churches of colonial Mexico and Peru, created through collaboration between European architects and indigenous craftsmen, represent artistic achievements that could not have been produced by either culture working alone. The scientific achievements of Spanish colonial scholars, from the linguistic studies of indigenous languages to the botanical investigations of American flora, advanced human knowledge in ways that benefited all of humanity. The urban planning innovations that created the distinctive Spanish colonial city established principles of civic design that continue to influence contemporary urban development. The legal innovations that attempted to balance indigenous rights with colonial authority, while imperfectly implemented, established precedents for contemporary discussions of indigenous rights and cultural autonomy. The educational institutions that provided higher education to students of all racial backgrounds created models of multicultural education that remain relevant today. As we consider the legacy of the Spanish Empire in our contemporary global age, we can see both continuities and contrasts with current global challenges. The Spanish Empire faced questions about how to govern diverse populations across vast distances, how to balance central authority with local autonomy, how to accommodate different cultural traditions within unified institutional systems, and how to manage economic systems that connected distant regions with different resources and needs. These same challenges face the contemporary global community as we attempt to create international institutions that can address global problems while respecting national sovereignty and cultural diversity. The European Union, the United Nations, and other international organizations grapple with questions of governance and representation that echo the challenges faced by Spanish imperial administrators 3 centuries ago. The Spanish Empire's experience with cultural mixing and synthesis offers valuable insights for contemporary multicultural societies. The Spanish colonial recognition that cultural diversity could be a source of strength rather than merely a problem to be solved established principles that remain relevant for contemporary discussions of immigration, multiculturalism, and cultural integration. The economic innovations of the Spanish Empire, particularly the creation of global trading networks and currency systems, prefigured the contemporary global economy and offer insights into both the possibilities and challenges of economic globalization. The Spanish experience with managing global economic systems across vast distances and different political jurisdictions provides historical perspective on contemporary debates about international trade and economic governance. Perhaps most importantly, the Spanish Empire's ultimate transformation from a centralized imperial system into a community of independent nations that maintain cultural and linguistic connections offers a model for how global governance might evolve in the future. The contemporary Spanish-speaking world, while politically fragmented into dozens of independent countries, maintains cultural, economic, and social connections that transcend national boundaries. This evolution from empire to cultural community suggests possibilities for how other global regions might develop, maintaining unity and cooperation, while respecting political autonomy and cultural diversity. The success of organizations like the Organization of American States and the Ibero-American Summit in fostering cooperation among Spanish-speaking countries demonstrates that shared cultural heritage can provide foundations for international cooperation that transcend historical grievances and political differences. As we conclude our examination of the Spanish Empire, we must resist both the temptation to romanticize its achievements and the equally misleading tendency to focus exclusively on its failures. The Spanish Empire was a human institution, created by human beings with all their capabilities and limitations, operating in historical circumstances that were often challenging and always complex.